Okay, all right. Hello, everybody. I hope you all had a great week. It's obviously Saturday now, so a person from my server saw me talking about Venezuela on stream. Actually, to be honest, a lot of what I was saying is stuff he had told me, and he is from Venezuela, and he's kind of very knowledgeable about the whole topic, so he asked to come on to tell the story. And someone had done a big comment post, kind of going through some of the areas where he thought I was wrong. So it's a topic I don't know a ton of stuff about. So I think he wanted to come on and tell a story. So I said, sure, that sounds great. So hey man, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great.
All right, so he sent me a PowerPoint, which is close to my heart because half of my job is working on these. And we will go through it. So just for you guys here, I'm going to mostly just let him talk. If I have questions, if somebody says something really interesting in the chat. But otherwise, tell your truth, kid.
So true, King. Wait, hold on. Can you share your screen on our private chat just so I can see that PowerPoint as we talk?
Sure. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Excellent. So the Venezuela question, I sort of cheekily titled it this because I think it's one of the most underappreciated crises of the 21st century, just how insane of a population transfer we're talking about. 25% and counting of the population is left over the past 10 years. So this is sort of like Anglo-Saxon migration levels or end of the Roman Empire levels of population transfer. This is not something we have ever experienced in the Western Hemisphere. And whether or not people appreciate that, it's going to transform their lives if they live in the United States, in Canada, elsewhere in Latin America, even some parts of Europe. There's a lot of Venezuelans fleeing, and it's not, at first it was sort of like the upper classes, but now it's absolutely everyone because the country's collapsed to such an extent that people are just going wherever they can, whether it's legally or illegally. So
isn't Ecuador and Peru almost facing like economic collapse because of how
yes.
bad it is? Because isn't there like
Yeah.
a million? I forget if it was in Ecuador there was a million, but it was some like ridiculous proportion relative to their population.
It was in Peru. Peru didn't really start getting lots of Venezuelans until like 2018, 2019. But by now there's 1.5 million of them in the country. And most of them are sort of like illegal aliens who crossed the border because they couldn't even get a passport. So they just like walked through Colombia. And Colombia didn't want them because they have their own Venezuelan overpopulation. So then they just kept going down, some to Ecuador, some to Peru. And now they work sort of like whatever job they can find, be it like prostitution or drug dealing, or it's really quite sad how rapidly the situation has deteriorated because Venezuela actually used to be a magnet for migrants themselves. In the 1950s and 60s, there were Spaniards and Italians, and later in the 70s and 80s, there were Arabs and Chileans and Argentinians who moved to Venezuela. So it actually used to attract lots of migration itself because it was such a nice place. And now that it's collapsed, the tables have completely flipped.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we can just go. As I was saying, just 7.7 million people have left since 2014. That's, as I said, a quarter of the population. Imagine if like 1 in 4 people just like disappeared. That's kind of, like the incumbent brain drain and capital flight and all that happens. It's a complete disaster. So everyone in this hemisphere is involved. And I know this is going to make a lot of people cringe. And we're going to talk about that a little later because I know you got some comments about it. But these people really are, the people in charge of Venezuela really are just global communists. And I know some people are going to be like, well, the state doesn't run every industry and there's private property or whatever. But, like functionally, like if you look at Cuba or Angola or even the late Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, these were communist countries, but they had some level of black market industry and varying levels of private ownership, especially in Cuba to this day. A lot of people don't realize just how much private ownership there is, just as sort of like under the table.
And these planned economies don't work, so inevitably you have to have some sort of market mechanism, even if it's unofficial.
Right, exactly. And there's a lot of the Venezuelan economy that happens under the table in American dollars, which is pretty funny because the currency is so useless now. But yeah, these people are plugged into the same sort of Cold War networks internationally that Che Guevara was, or that Fidel Castro was. In fact, there's always rumblings of Cuban spies, and it's kind of hard to know from the outside like how accurate they are. But people start hearing Cuban accents when there were no Cubans before. There's Russians all over the oil industry, which didn't used to be the case. And I'll illustrate. There's even a Ba'athist connection to Saddam Hussein and various factions of the Lebanese civil war. All of which are infiltrated in the government. One of them, in fact, was even the vice president for a short amount of time. So there's lots of really shady connections. And I know, again, people are going to be like, oh, but Putin's based, or Saddam Hussein was based. And yeah, I mean, if you're an anti-American or whatever, then sure. But these people are plugged into, as I said, communist networks from the late 20th century, and they actively use it to undermine what they perceive as American interests.
Well, regardless of how you feel about Putin, Russia is a great power, and they act in their own self-interest, and having influence over one of the world's largest oil producers is in their self-interest. And if they have to, like, say or do some stuff that might be slightly inconsistent with how they run their country, I mean, that's just what they're going to do. That's what any great power would do.
Right. And lastly, Maduro is just not your friend. We'll talk about this at the very end, but these people are just idiots, and they hate you, and they hate America. And if you're white, these people, or if you're a Christian even, because I know some people say like, oh, they're good for the church. They're really, really not. And but we'll get into that a little bit later. Just sort of wanted to give some context, so you can go next.
I would just why I would say that they're why I use the term communist instead of just socialist is I feel like there's a level of totalitarianism. Like a single party control of the country, tendency towards violent revolution, and stuff like that you see in Venezuela beyond that of just countries that have more of just a socialist economy.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think when people hear socialist, they think like Canadian healthcare, or they think of Britain pre-Thatcher, and that's really not what these people are. They're a lot closer to, again, Cuba today than they are to the Britain of the 1970s. Whether or not that's a socialist place, is up for debate, but it's very much in the latter camp and not the former. So who am I to talk? I am ultimately just a dude. I was born and raised there, up through high school down there. Moved to the U.S. in 2010 just because that's when the expropriations really kicked into high gear, and my dad was sort of like in the crosshairs for losing his factory. So he's sort of like, it's kind of funny, starts out just baking bread in his mom's garage after losing his job at 24, and then grows that into a giant business that, it's like the perfect success story, right? Almost like the American dream in Latin America. And eventually starts getting government contracts because the government starts contracting out food after the scarcity and the shortages begin. And the moment you sign a pact with the devil, it's only a matter of time before the devil takes over your soul. And so we saw the writing on the wall and left. And I think my experience is sort of, at the very least, representative of most Venezuelans, upper middle class Venezuelans who left to places like the US or Spain before the big 2013 crisis, which is where like the migrant crisis exploded. So I'm from an older migration. I do remember a lot of the country, and I still have family in the country, so I'm fairly plugged in. And we have contacts, like most people in the upper middle class, we have contacts in banking and contacts in the oil industry, just because everybody does. When oil is 80% of your economy, a lot of people in oil.
In the Venezuela deep state?
Yes, actually. I have a friend whose dad is a banker and embezzled a bunch of money and went to jail. It's crazy. Mm-hmm. So I know a fair bit. Okay, so I structured this. Again, the Maduro stuff isn't even till the end. So, and you can feel free to skip around if you think we're giving too much context. But I think it's important for people to understand how we got to where we got today. So there's, context in Venezuela, context in Hugo Chavez and then his policies, and then sort of like talking about those global connections and the Great Exodus. So you can get started now, I think. What's of Venezuela? Again, the context you never hear. And I think this next picture here is the picture that best describes Venezuela. If you want to understand this country, you have to understand that it's almost like two separate countries in one, where you have sort of like a Barcelona or a Buenos Aires type of city surrounded by like Haiti. And it's such great poverty living within a 20-minute drive from extravagant wealth. Or not extravagant wealth, but like a middle income country. And this causes a great gulf. You can go to the next picture.
Yeah, my interpretation of Latin America is it's the most unequal part in the world because there's like a middle and upper class that's very distinct from the lower. Whereas in Africa, there isn't even a middle or upper class. It's just a ruling class and everyone else. Also, there's a lot of wealth in Latin America where there isn't in most of Africa. But
yes, and that's kind of what I'm illustrating here. You can see all four of these pictures are within a 20-minute drive of each other. This is in Caracas, the capital city, and it's like two entirely different planets.
Yeah.
So population, roughly 30 million people. 7 million of them have left, again, over the past 10 years primarily. So you can see it's in the northern tip of Latin America. The demographic question is a really interesting one. Because a lot of people will be like, oh, who cares if Maduro is anti-white? They're not a white country. And yes and no. As you can see from the chart, it used to be roughly 50-50. As a former Spanish colony, there was the infamous caste system where you had the Spaniards at the top and then you had the blacks and Indians at the bottom. And most people were mixed somewhere in the middle. That sort of like mixed population was roughly half of the country.
Are there no Amerindians there?
Surprisingly few. And like the thing is, I think the Amerindian and black components are very much undercounted because they just see themselves as mixed.
Right.
And Venezuela, if you can see in the map there, it's right in the confluence between South America and the Spanish Caribbean. And it isn't like Peru or Bolivia where there was like a big, like the Inca civilization that had like a large Amerindian population. Venezuela is kind of like a jungle backwater. There are a few tribes like the Caribs and the Arawaks, but they were very small in number. So actually the primary component, if you look at the genetic analysis, is vindicated of Venezuela is Spanish and West African, because like most of the Spanish Caribbean, Venezuela in its early history was a cash crop economy, where you had the Spanish overlords ruling over vast sugarcane plantations or tobacco plantations, later coffee and cocoa beans. So that becomes sort of like the core of the population is the African slaves and the Spanish masters. And yes, there were many Amerindians initially, but again, because there were never like any big urban centers, they were just largely subsumed into that mixed race population.
Race in Latin America is really complicated.
Right, yeah. But what's interesting about Venezuela in the topic of race in particular is that was the reality that just sort of like mixed, like, yes, maybe 20% white overclass. And then most people were mixed, and there were some blacks and Indians, and they were undercounted because they lived in remote areas. That was the reality until roughly like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, when oil really picks up under a military dictatorship. And after World War II, there's lots of refugees in Europe, and at the time, America was under the 1924 Immigration Act, which is very restrictive. And unless you were like Northern European, you were basically not getting into the U.S. So a lot of those refugees actually ended up in South America, and a surprising number ended up in Venezuela, especially Italians. There were roughly 1 million Italians, 200,000 Portuguese, 100,000 Spaniards, 100,000 Germans, 50,000 Hungarians. I forget some of the other numbers, but those are the larger groups that came to Venezuela between the 1960s and 70s, especially. And especially the Spaniards came a little bit later, under the later years of the Franco regime in Spain. So that significantly boosted the white population of the country. A lot of those immigrants assimilated very rapidly into the sort of white population, to the point where up until the migrations, the country is roughly 50% mixed, that sort of historic colonial population, and 50% white. And like people are going to be like, oh, but it's Italians and Portuguese, are they white? It's like, well, white enough that the government considers him white and complains about colonization. And yes, it's all relative. If you're in an Anglo country, then maybe they wouldn't look like you necessarily, but they're white enough that they became the white bloc in the country, and because they brought with them industry and lumber mills and pasta and all these things, they later became the target of a lot of the communist rhetoric. And if you look at those earlier pictures of the big glass buildings versus the favelas, like, you can tell who lives where. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I'll say on the race question. You'll also see there's an Arab component that comes into play later.
Is that mostly Christian Lebanese or Christian Arabs?
Yes. Well, it used to be mostly Christian Lebanese. So in the 1970s and 80s, you had the infamous Lebanese civil war, where Lebanon goes from being narrowly majority Christian to being 30% Christian. A lot of those Christians migrated, some of them to Michigan, but actually the majority of them ended up in Latin America, especially in Chile and Venezuela, because those were the more prosperous countries at the time. So there's a large Orthodox Christian population in Venezuela, roughly 1 million people now, most of them Syrian and Lebanese. There's also a Druze population, and there's actually a connection there between the Druze and the Ba'ath Party of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. We'll talk about that later. But it's not insignificant. It's 6%. It's more than there's Asians in the U.S.
Aren't they kind of a business class in Latin America? Tom Sowell has the term middleman minority, wherein they manage a lot of international trade, or they're disproportionately wealthy. My understanding is because they look pretty Mediterranean and they're Christian, they integrate pretty well in Latin America, and they've been quite successful there.
Yes, all of that is 100% accurate. And in fact, little known fact, Shakira, the singer from Colombia, is Arab. Most people don't even know about it because she just looks Hispanic.
Yeah, I think Selma Hayek is also half Lebanese, and Carlos Slim.
Yes. So early history, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if people know something about one Latin American country, they know about all of them. In the early history, liberated in the early 1800s by Simón Bolivar, who's sort of like Simón Bolivar, a big cult figure to this day. It's kind of like George Washington.
I read a biography on him. I actually, just a side note, I think he's actually underrated. I very seldom see him on lists of greatest military leaders. I think just in terms of like the logistical problems he overcame with his campaigns, he deserves a lot of credit for that. Sorry, just a side note, but I just...
Oh, no, totally. And it's funny because Venezuelans seem to agree with you. Venezuelans have a complex of like, oh, nobody recognizes us. We punch way above our weight. And Simón Bolivar is sort of like the main culprit of that complex, because he really did, like, within the span of 10 years, he went on horseback over the entire continent of South America and liberated basically the whole of it except for Brazil.
Well, and the South.
That was what's Argentina, Chile was
a
little bit different. Yeah.
His name.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But anyway, yeah. So Venezuela's liberated. Gran Colombia, actually, the union of Andean states that was supposed to take place between Colombia or what is now Colombia, and Venezuela and Ecuador, Peru. That was Bolivar's idea, and when he dies, that idea dies, and the country just becomes, just a bunch of warring caudillos and warlords for the next 100 years, until oil is found in the 1910s. And that's when you have Juan Vicente Gomez, that guy in the picture before. I just love the physiognomy in this guy, Marcos Pérez Jiménez. That's the military dictator. After oil is found, there's a bunch of political intrigue, assassinations. Eventually, this guy is installed by a military junta. And he's interesting because he's educated in the Chorrillos Military Academy in Peru, which is known as like the cradle of dictators. Manuel Noriega was educated there. He's the dictator of Panama. a lot of the people who worked in the Fujimori in Peru, who killed the Red Dawn and basically instituted a fascist dictatorship in Peru, were educated there. Hugo Chavez himself, interestingly enough, was educated there for a short time. So, sort of like elite dictator school, as it were. This is one of his the first alumni, and he rapidly modernizes the country. Hit next.
Just a side, so because I know
Yeah.
a bit about Colombia and some other. Was Venezuela a place where you had constant political violence between the left and right, or was it not as bad as
not
like Venezuela? Or sorry, as Colombia or Mexico or some of the other countries?
Yeah, no, surprisingly not, right? So because a lot of the interests are sort of agricultural, and there's not like a large literate population before the big immigration in the 50s and 60s, there's not even a lot of interest in politics because a lot of people are just scraping by, dying in a random like warlords attack, harvesting cocoa beans. So there's not really a big push for communism, and therefore no real like right-left politics until this guy comes into power, and he sort of allies himself with Francisco Franco and other dictators, or Salazar, all these characters. And yeah, basically all of modern Venezuela was architected by this guy who was a civil engineer by trade, actually. So he built a lot of roads, a lot of buildings, a lot of infrastructure projects, cable cars. It was kind of his thing. And to this day, a lot of the big infrastructure landmarks in the country, all the highways and power stations are still from the 1950s because of this guy. All the big university he basically is the founder of modern Venezuela, because he was a dictator and because he engaged in some really brutal suppression of the rising communist sentiment. Because yes, when they imported all these Spaniards from Franco's regime, a lot of them were dissidents seeking to flee Franco. So there was a bit of an injection of communism at first. So this guy just like brutally repressed them. And there's all the stories like, oh, he like tortured them and took their fingernails out. And I mean, he did some pretty brutal stuff. But as a result, it's kind of like Pinochet, where you don't know what the horrors you missed out on. People just see the cruelties of the dictatorship for what there are on the surface.
Sorry, did you say that this guy was a civil engineer prior to
Yes.
becoming? Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just thought this picture was funny. Charles Delgado Chalbaud, I just call him the Chud. Great physiognomy. This is actually the head architect of the coup that puts him in power. I just thought people would appreciate this picture. And then eventually he is overthrown by and this is interesting. The circumstances are kind of mysterious, and people say it was a CIA coup because again he was sort of like Franco aligned. I have no trouble believing this is just internal discontents because he was so brutal in repressing political dissent. Either way, I don't think it matters. He is ousted by a military coup, and this guy Romulo Betancourt, of French descent, becomes the first. They call him the founding father of Venezuelan democracy. And amusingly, after his presidential term, he can't run for re-election because that's how they set the Constitution. So he just becomes senator for life, and is basically like a second president. Very interesting guy. Architect of the Puntofijo Pact, which so people like to put scare quotes around the democracy around this period because basically all but his party were outlawed. So there are three parties. Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, that's his party. COPE is the Christian Democrat Party. That's like sort of like the main opposition, but they're only ever like 30-40% of the country. And then there's a couple smaller parties no one's ever heard of. And these are the only parties that are allowed to exist, to run for Congress or for president. And some people cynically say, well, that's just trading one dictatorship for another. But, people do have some choice. And it's enough that it creates the feeling of democracy and there's no political repression of dissidents or whatever. People are allowed to say whatever they want, and it becomes sort of a shit show in the media. But the U.S. is happy, so there's no threat of coup or anything. And the immigration and industry that has started under the dictatorship a decade earlier just explodes, and Venezuela becomes unbelievably wealthy on the back of oil. Especially during the 1970s, there's the Yom Kippur War and the ensuing oil crises in the Middle East, which massively increases the price of oil. The U.S. suffers famously under Nixon and Carter and all these other characters because of the energy shortages. Venezuela is becoming fabulously wealthy around this time, to the point where in 1976 Venezuela is the fourth highest GDP in the entire world. This is a country that is rapidly becoming incredibly wealthy. And these are just some pictures Kennedy actually visited around this time. This sort of gives you an idea of the growing sort of right alignment in the Cold War of Venezuela.
Yeah, this looks very American, very much like they're trying to imitate.
Yes, yeah, definitely very like mid-century modern, like we want to be like you, America type of deal. And what happens here is, and I show the population density map because it's really illustrative of what's the underlying phenomena on the ground. So you have, yes, all this wealth, all this industrialization, the growth of steel and lumber and low-end manufacturing, all on the back of oil. All these immigrants from places like Italy and Spain are bringing industry with them. Especially the German minority is very involved. There's also a very influential Jewish minority after World War II. They're particularly numerous, maybe like 20,000 people, but they're like extremely influential in industry. There's a guy, Solomon Levi Cohen, is the owner of like half of the shopping malls in Venezuela. So, you have all these like a very cosmopolitan European / mixed race Venezuela growing in the cities. But then in the countryside, you still have very much that like old colonial peasant culture, like abysmal literacy rates. We're talking like 20% literacy rates in some towns, largely like Afro-descended or like mixed race. So descendants of slaves, people who had been destitute for literally hundreds of years. And they, upon seeing the fabulous wealth that's accumulated in cities like Caracas or Maracaibo or Valencia, decide they want in. It makes sense. It's kind of like the Great Migration in the U.S., where you have people fleeing from the South, primarily black people, but also just poor whites, into cities like Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. The exact same phenomenon happens where you have this massive rural flight to the point where Venezuela becomes the most urbanized country in all of Latin America. You see the population density, it's like night and day. It's kind of hard to spam maybe, but it's like the difference between the red and the orange is pretty stark. And it's largely due to the fact that the country
it's very extreme. Although it's probably a bit like Canada, where the southern, like 60% of the country is just unusable. I would is it just jungle and stuff and mountains and stuff like that?
Yes, it is very dense. Some of the oldest mountains in the world, the Tepuis, are there, and that's kind of like a national park. They're not allowed to disturb that, except for oil extraction, of course. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's very difficult land, and what you end up with is this. I think this is a very illustrative picture of the late Fourth Republic, as they like to. They're kind of like France. They're like, oh, we're the Fourth Republic. They title their constitutions and such that way, where you see like weird, like mid-century modern concrete architecture. It's sort of like the height of opulence and kind of ugly now, but at the time it was seen as very modern. And then around it, you start to see these are shanty towns, kind of like the ones I showed earlier in the stream. And this is the beginning of the formation of what will become the Chavez reality, right? Where it's like you got the rich, and they have very low birth rates. They live in big opulent buildings, kind of aging now because nothing new is being built. And then around them, it's just like these hordes of basically Haitians living in absolute destitute poverty. And a lot of these people can't read or write. Many of them don't even have, because these are shanty towns, just like corrugated metal and brick built illegally on top of hills around the city. So many of them don't even have running water. And increasingly, this starts leading to crime. And in all the expected
ways. It looks like a shit-tier version of Blade Runner. Like the big pyramid that the Tyrell Corporation's in, but just really bad. Yeah, it's rough.
Yeah. Yeah. People say nobody called it the Fourth Republic before Chavez. This is true, actually. I should make a correction. Chavez sort of like reframed a lot of what happened here, and perhaps even unbeknownst to me, some of what I'm telling you is sort of like the Hugo Chavez story, because it's become so ingrained in the culture that it's kind of hard to differentiate how much of it is narrative versus reality. But like, I mean, the pictures and the numbers and the facts speak for themselves.
Well, I mean, we
But
use
yes,
anachronistic terms. Like, they never called themselves, to my knowledge, the Byzantines. We just use that because saying Eastern Roman Empire is confusing.
There, yeah. Yeah. But anyway, yes, Hugo Chavez, probably the most important person in this conversation. He's dead and is still haunting the country. Go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Or no, I switched it to this one.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So growing discontent, as I mentioned, Venezuela becomes very wealthy on the back of oil. Oil is not a very stable commodity, as we know. So yes, boomed in the 70s, completely crashes and burns in the 80s. It's horrific, to the point where the government has no idea what to do with this massive population that's been flooding into the cities for the past 20 years. And, because they tried at first to build houses, but they couldn't keep up with demand. And once the price of oil crashes, they don't even have the money to do that. They don't have the infrastructure to provide services or welfare to any of these people. So what ensues is just a series of lootings, culminating in the Caracazo, which is an infamous, it's basically the BLM 2020 riots, and this is in 1989. And,
or LA riots. There was a lot of riots all over the place. I mean, the late 80s were a period of a lot of social change. So I take it they weren't able to diversify their industry at all.
They tried. There's a lot of private interest in doing that, but the government had no incentive to stop the money flowing, because yes, they could invest in some of the private, and boost some of the private investment that people were making into, again, lumber and steel. Steel was big back in the day. Plastics were big, though those are petroleum derivatives. But Venezuela is more interested in raking in the money, and this is where you start to get the really bad corruption. There's a story. Jaime Lucinchi was of Italian descent, president in the 1980s. Is infamous for having built this giant hippodromo. It's like a horse racing stadium. It's a racetrack, and betting on really expensive Arab horses, bringing in super expensive horses from abroad, and then getting blackout drunk, and then like he'd be gone for days because nobody knew where he was, and he just like passed out in the presidential palace. And his wife eventually became sort of like the joke is that the wife was the actual president. And these stories are kind of like commonplace throughout the 80s. Gross mismanagement. They could have diversified, but didn't, because the president and their cronies were just like busy plundering the public coffers. And this is just sort of like how Latin America works.
It's how most, probably the country, sorry, just as an aside, that's most responsibly used its oil wealth is Norway has put all of its oil revenues into the Norwegian pension fund, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund on earth. I think they own something like 1% of the global stocks, but they basically put all of it into a rainy day fund. Someone in the chat says the Caracazo wasn't a spontaneous event. It's been proven it was organized by Justro's dad.
Ooh, okay, yes. So the Cuban connection is very tenuous, and there's a lot of things that are quote unquote not part of the court history, as it were. Obviously, there's a lot of contention as to what the official facts are in the Cold War. But yes, there are known. This is not sort of in the historical record, because the academic left obviously has an interest in hiding a lot of these things. But around this time, Fidel Castro, remember this is the height of the Cold War, Cuba is an incredibly influential country in sort of promoting global communism, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And they have sleeper cells, agents planted all over Colombia, feeding the FARC and other communist groups in Colombia. In Venezuela, they're more like covert sleeper cells in like corporations and media, and to the point where prisons are actually starting to get filled with Cubans. suspiciously, because there was never a big Cuban immigration to Venezuela, but all of a sudden you get all these Cubans in prisons. How did they end up there? And were they getting imprisoned on purpose to network? It's all very dubious. I didn't include it because a lot of that is hearsay and not necessarily confirmed. But in the height of all this, Hugo Chavez, the protagonist of the story, or antagonist, if you want to call him that, emerges. Poor, he is one of those people born in destitute poverty in the countryside, of a mulatto background, to school teachers, history teachers specifically, which goes into his sort of like delusions of grandeur. He believes himself to be the reincarnation of Ezequiel Zamora, who is a Civil War leader. So imagine if Nick Fuentes was like, "Oh yes, I'm the reincarnation of Robert E. Lee." It's kind of Chavez's brand. So under this ideology of his, he joins the military at the age of 17, and quickly climbs through the ladder. He's not particularly competent, but he is very charismatic and a good talker. Mm-hmm. You get to the point where and it's disputed how close he actually was to the presidential guard, but he himself alleges to have carried the drunk. I mentioned President Lucinchi, who would bet on horses all the time. He would go on rants about how, yes, when he was blackout drunk, I was the one carrying him back to the presidential palace. So very much radicalized by what he sees, and is recruited by these communist Cuban sleeper cells in the military. And he begins to orchestrate a coup. All throughout the 1980s, he develops basically a parallel, sort of paramilitary type of operation, where he's recruiting all sorts of discontents, some of them Colombian mercenaries from FARC, some of them just discontents within the military. He starts getting funding from left-leaning businessmen and academics, and eventually in 1992 launches what becomes an unsuccessful, but very dramatic and well-televised coup attempt. If you can go to the next slide. This whole thing is just incredible footage. It's kind of hard to tell. It's in black and white because it's a picture from a newspaper, but there were tanks rolling all over Caracas at the middle of the night, and they crash into the presidential palace. Imagine sort of like a military insurrection that crashes a tank right into the White House. That's kind of what happens in 1992. Eventually, Chavez is, of course, detained because, despite having a very large and surprisingly well-orchestrated military operation, most of the military is still loyal to the government.
Unlike in Argentina, the coup of 43, where basically the entire military defected, he just wasn't able to get a critical mass needed to overthrow the government.
Right. Yes. So, wait, if you can go back for a sec. Before getting imprisoned for attempted regicide, basically, Chavez gives a very iconic, well-televised speech to his compatriots and conspirators or whatever. And the speech catapults him into stardom in Venezuela, especially among the lower classes that we've been talking about. He says, and you can look up the speech for himself. It's not terribly long. I'm sure it's subtitled somewhere. Mm-hmm. But basically saying, yes, we have failed today, but the revolution lives on. And he becomes such a sort of international sensation that you get all these human rights groups pressuring the president to pardon him. Which he actually does, bizarrely, if you can go next. After only a year in prison, where again he sort of starts networking with all these Cuban groups more explicitly, he is pardoned by the president, who's sort of facing his own corruption scandal and wants a sort of good win for himself in the public eye. So under the growing pressure of NGOs and media groups crying for human rights or whatever, he pardons him. He runs for president, and he wins in a three-way race. And this is sort of the beginning of the end for Venezuela. In 1996 or 98, ossified sort of political monoculture. At this point, by the way, the Puntofijo Pact, the thing with the political parties, that arrangement collapses because all the parties are like massively unpopular. It's kind of like a worse version of America today, where everybody hates Republicans, everybody hates Democrats.
Maybe more like the UK today.
Yes, actually,
all
that's
the
more
major
accurate
parties are just walking corpses at this point.
Right, exactly. So but both of the major parties, Democratic Action and Coup, both crater, so they're forced to lift restrictions on which parties can run, and you get this really weird three-way race between Chavez, who runs this. He calls himself Movimiento Quinta República, so like the Fifth Republic movement, and that's where he starts framing himself like, we're gonna redo the Constitution and we're gonna start the 21st century under a new type of socialism. That's sort of his movement.
Oh, he's the one who came up with socialism for the 21st century?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's an establishment politician. I forget even his name. It doesn't really matter. And what's funny, there's also a Miss Universe pageant winner. Venezuela is known for having the most Miss Universe winners in a row. I think it's something like 7.
Really?
or I think 7 is the total that's ever won. It's like the most of any country outside of the U.S. The pageant industry and plastic surgery and all that is huge in Venezuela. Very the sexual marketplace, as it were, there is absolutely insane. It's sort of like an arms race of maybe I shouldn't get into that, but Irene Saez, after winning Miss Universe in 1981. Becomes mayor of Chacao, which is a major city at the time, very crime infested, though wealthy. It's kind of like if Taylor Swift became mayor of Chicago,
right?
and instituted like right-wing death squads with like booty shorts and safari hats, and actually like massively curbed crime. And to this day, Chicago is like the wealthiest city in the U.S. So it's sort of absolutely bizarre story. She runs for president in '98. Doesn't get very far, but is enough that Chavez wins with 56% of the vote. Absolutely bizarre election. And so begins the Fifth Republic, so-called.
Just keep going. I'll be back in 1 second.
Okay, sure. Chavez's first move as president is to rewrite the entire Constitution. He does a number of things. Number one, he eliminates the one-term limit. This is the one aspect of the Puntofijo Pact that remained in place. Presidents could run for multiple non-consecutive terms as long as they didn't do it in the same party. So basically, no one ever did. There were 2 presidents who did it, Carlos Andrés Pérez and Rafael Caldera. It doesn't really matter. The point is there were limits on consecutive terms. And it was really difficult to run for a non-consecutive term. So basically, no one ever did it. Chavez, obviously, having a transformative, revolutionary project for the country, couldn't just be limited to 5 years because that would be a total failure. And then the country would revert back to status quo. So he eliminates the term limits. He kneecaps the National Assembly, which is the legislature. The National Assembly was the most powerful of the 3 branches of the government in Venezuela back in the day. And Chavez basically removes all their ability to roadblock him. So he can basically go unopposed and he can rule by decree, sort of by the equivalent of ruling by executive action and the legislature having absolutely nothing to do with the actual laws that are being made. He also subordinates the National Justice Tribunal, which is the federal court, to himself. He rigs it so that he can pack the court with as many people as he wants, without any repercussions or any checks on himself, which is absolutely insane. Imagine like if Joe Biden is like, yeah, today we're just gonna appoint 5 more judges to the Supreme Court. That's kind of what happens.
I think what Perón did was when the Supreme Court was blocking his policies, he just impeached the entire Supreme Court. I think is his plan because he controlled Congress.
Yeah, and it's kind of what happens here. So anyway, so he basically rewrites the entire Constitution to make himself dictator in all but name. He also creates the Consejo Nacional Electoral, the election. It's kind of like if there's a U.S. Department of Elections, and it's all, of course, his appointees. So all sorts of weird shit happens. There's also sorts of what would be considered election irregularities, vote totals randomly changing, tax funds being used for his own personal campaign, people not being allowed to participate in debates, all sorts of things. But because he has the CNE, he can basically get away with whatever he wants and rig the elections in his way. So this is literally the first thing he does. He rewrites the constitution. He also renames the country, bizarrely. We'll talk about this a little bit more.
Isn't it the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela?
Yes. So remember, as I mentioned, he's got like a schizo, and he actually believes he can commune with the ghost of Simón Bolívar. To the point where there would often be, whenever there were cabinet meetings, he would leave an empty chair next to himself. And people would be like, oh, who's that for? And it's like, oh, it's the ghost of Simón Bolívar. I can hear him talking to me.
Now, if I recall, just a side note, from the biography on Simón Bolívar, towards the end of his life, he had a kind of "what have I done" moment with regards to just kind of the liberals who were how liberal Gran Colombia had gone, and he's like, "Okay, we've gone a bit far here." I don't know if that's true. That was just what the biography of him said.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know because there's a lot of forged, because he is sort of like a mythical figure. He's like once the George Washington and John Adams and Andrew Jackson, like all in one. So there's a lot of like forged correspondence that we now know is fake. There's a very famous book, El General en su laberinto, which is about sort of like exactly what you're talking about, like Chavez, Bolivar in his last years. Dealing with the consequences of his actions and regretting a lot of what he's done. So that much is true. It's not entirely clear why he regretted it. I think there's a lot of dispute over what he actually believed. And this is why Chavez feels so free to appropriate him for himself as sort of like his figure. And he says that, well, Bolivar was actually just a revolutionary like me. And if he lived today, he would be a communist. Kind of a deal. And he renames the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Mind you, there's already a Bolivar cult in the country. The currency is called the Bolivar. If that tells you anything, it's like the one historical figure that people even know about in Venezuela.
I will give him credit for one thing. It's nice whenever there's countries that don't have generic names. Like, it's not just the Republic of. So I'll give him credit for that. Oh. You said, right. Okay, I'm just looking at this. Or maybe you covered this while I was gone. So they started nationalizing a lot of private farms and stuff?
Yes, this is basically a flex, because one of the powers he gives himself is the ability to expropriate at will. Because normally, if you're expropriating, you have to go through a court process, eminent domain, all that stuff. He removes those restrictions, and he can basically just point at something and say, expropriated! And he does this as kind of like a flex on people who doubted him, and because mind you, he won the presidential election. The legislature is still overwhelmingly against him, which is why he kneecaps them. So then he uses this as a sort of power move to show, hey, if you fuck with me, I'm gonna take all your assets and there's nothing you can do about it. So he does that.
Trigger capital flight?
Yes, this is the first. We can talk a little bit about it later, but there's a coup attempt happening exactly because of this. And also he becomes massively popular, not only because, or with the underclasses anyway, not only because he is taking all power and money for himself and giving it to them, but also actually undergoing, and like credit where credit is due. Like these communities that I mentioned, a lot of these like places without running water, just in the outskirts of the city with literacy rates of 20%. These people voted for him, and he basically just rewarded them for voting for him. He gave them goodies, like microwaves and satellite dishes.
I mean, you can say what
refrigerators.
You want about like Perón and the Sandinistas, but they did deliver on a lot of their stuff for the lower classes in terms of education and running water and electricity and stuff like that. Now, just to think, because I remember when I studied Latin America in university, my understanding is a lot of the land is owned by big landowners who don't actually use it. Is that true, or?
It's debated. Some of that does exist. Private contractors who buy land for like surveying operations, who find mineral resources and then just never use it. It's debated how much that actually happens.
Because I was told it's a status symbol to just own land. Although this was about Brazil, but I don't know if it's the same here. Because my understanding
I'm not terribly
is,
familiar with Brazil now.
okay, because my understanding is in some cases, land reform does actually make sense because of excessive rent seeking or stuff like that. Although once again, there's a difference between did he was any of this compensated or did they just grab it?
No, you just grabbed it.
Okay.
And it's funny because the owners, a lot of the, like, people can talk all they want about, like, oh, people hoarding land that they don't use or whatever, but these were farmers who just had cattle or chickens or whatever, and they ran a cheese operation or whatever. All of a sudden the government's like, oh no, you're too wealthy, you're opposed to me, whatever, so I'm just gonna, and like the farmers were among the biggest private interest against Chavez. So he's like, oh, you're talking shit about me on television? I saw that interview you did the other day. You know what? Your farm is mine now. He's like, yeah, you'll get paid, whatever. It's like 20 years, they still haven't gotten paid. Probably never will.
Kind of like the kulaks in the Soviet Union were like, oh, we have to take out the wealthy peasants who own like a horse instead of no horse, and they're the class enemies.
Right.
What is
exactly
this mission thing?
Oh yeah, that's what I was talking about. So when Chavez goes to a lot of these communities, he goes, yes, to these very poor urban communities. He also goes out to like the equivalent of Indian reservations out in the middle of nowhere, and tries to integrate those people into the Venezuelan society. And in a very like cultural move, I'll talk about this later. He names all 26 of the indigenous languages of these peoples, all official languages with Spanish, even though nobody speaks them. So he has a very he makes it a point to have a lot of indigenous outreach as his kind of like Justin Trudeau, where it's like land acknowledgements and going out to these reservations and teaching these people Spanish and integrating them into the economy. It's a big part of his platform because he recognizes that sort of like an untapped electoral coalition. Nobody's like courting the Indian vote because they don't even read and write. He attempts to change that, and by bringing them over to his side, they're all going to think he's a hero and vote for him. And it works, actually. There's roughly like 3% of the Venezuelan population is Amerindian. They're counted as like the mix or whatever, but like actual Amerindians are maybe like 3% of the population. They all vote for him, like overwhelmingly, like 90%. So after all this happens, people lose their shit. Obviously, the legislature opposes him because there's a different party. Business interests oppose him because he's expropriating things left and right. The Catholic Church opposes him because he says some heretical things. And it's interesting, people talk about Chavez himself identifies as Catholic, but very much sort of like liberation theology, down with the conquistadors type of Catholicism. And the bishops are very much, Venezuelan bishops were among the more conservative in Venezuela, and so they all opposed him. Most of the media and the military were, firmly against everything that was going on, especially with the rewriting of the Constitution. And PDVSA is the petroleum state company. Petroleum was nationalized in 1979 during the height of surging oil prices. And, despite being a state-run company, it's actually mostly operated by private contractors from outside. Lots of people from Exxon and Mobil and, just the usual British Petroleum. Citgo is actually the biggest foreign firm in Venezuela, to the point where even to this day, if you go to a Citgo gas station, it's mostly Venezuelan oil. They all oppose him, obviously. So Sorry, just two side things in the chat. Someone's saying that when they expropriated the land, they didn't actually redistribute it to the peasants. The state just kept it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I should have mentioned that. So taking a lot of land, it's not like they're giving it to people to build it, to farm or whatever. They're just like, fuck you, you're hoarding this land, you're too rich, bye. So they take it, and then it just sits there.
So they didn't give it to like the sharecroppers or whoever was renting it. They just became the new landlords, kind of?
Yes.
Okay, because, that's important, because it sometimes, I think, makes sense if the people own their own land. But, and then someone else is saying that evangelicals support Chavez, and Chavez supports evangelical churches.
Ooh, okay. I don't go super deep into the religious component here, but yes,
Really?
the Catholic Church is in free fall in Venezuela, as it is in most of Latin America, and yes, a lot of the upper classes are just becoming like Reddit liberal atheists or whatever, but a lot of the lower classes dislike sort of like the pomp and circumstance. Again, a lot of liberation theology, which clashes with the more conservative Catholic Conference of Bishops. So then a lot of sort of the lower classes just eventually end up becoming evangelicals. And a lot of these illiterate communities are massively, I'm talking like 80% evangelical.
Because
To
I
the point
thought
where
they
Venezuela,
were more associated with the right in most of Latin America. Is it just different randomly in Venezuela?
I guess. Again, I haven't looked at the numbers in a long time, but my general impression is Catholicism is just in general in a lot of the decline. They're not terribly influential, except for maybe sort of like old moneyed families or whatever. Most of the population of the lower classes of either political leaning are increasingly evangelical, and a lot of the upper classes are just becoming atheists.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the KGB destroyed the Catholic Church in Latin America. Because wasn't it just really, really heavily infiltrated by communists?
Yes.
Yeah, throughout the Cold War.
And that's what liberation theology is, frankly. Like a lot of people like BS themselves into thinking, oh no, it's real gospel or whatever. It's very obvious if you look at the connections and who supports and who's against it. As it rises in the 1970s and 80s, it's very obviously communist infiltrators.
Mm-hmm.
I won't get too much into that because I know there's a lot of Catholics who will get upset at people I could mention in the church who are complicit in that to this day.
Oh no! Like I shit on the Catholic Church in Latin America a lot.
Well, as a Catholic myself, I don't want to engage in scandal or anything.
But no, okay, yeah, sure, by all means.
Okay, so go back a little bit. I'll try to speed through this because there's a lot of really dense content.
Right,
I don't know how,
yeah, sorry, go on, yeah.
how much all of it. Yeah, can you go back one slide? The Coup Attempt. Sorry, I was looking at the stream, looking at the chat. The Coup Attempt. Chavez, with all these people who oppose him, is ousted by a really flimsily and incompetently put together coup by this dude who wasn't even a politician, who's just a business leader with connections in oil and banking, Pedro Carmona. He basically just gets a rogue faction from the military to like take Chavez to a private island and be like, hey, yeah, how about a resort? And they just lock him up there. And he installs himself as interim president, completely violating the Constitution. So everyone's just like up in arms. They're like, oh, you care about the Constitution, so you're going to completely violate it? What? Installs himself and then immediately breaks all the unions that helped put him together in power, because they're technically syndicates, which are not one-to-one with unions, but basically unions, people in the military and business who put him together. He just disbands and he's like, oh, fuck unions. And just sort of installs himself. Massive protests erupt because now you have people who supported the coup but feel betrayed by it, and every single Chavez supporter goes out to the streets, and it just becomes this massive shit show. Protests, I'm talking like over 1 million people on the streets. Military just starts firing on civilians, like 50 people die in 4 days, and then they realize, well, maybe we shouldn't just be shooting them indiscriminately. So this coup is like massively unpopular, totally bungled, not even supported by the majority of the opposition. In fact, the opposition politicians didn't even know this was going to happen. This is all sort of done clandestinely. Some people point to this as having been the CIA. I think it's, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Seems to me too incompetent even for them, frankly. And again, there's enough discontent in the country that I have no trouble believing that this is just some schizo with enough money to blow on private military factions or whatever. Whatever the case may be, the main military reinstalls Chavez, deposes this guy who's now in exile, and Chavez becomes massively popular after this because he's sort of seen as like the hero who fought for the people. So you can go next. And then, of course, Chavez isn't sure who to trust anymore because he thought he could trust the people around him. He thought he could trust the people in the National Presidential Guard. He thought he could trust people in the military. Clearly not all of them. So he begins a massive purge. Just PDVSA, the state oil company alone, loses over half of its employees. 18,000 of them just fired in one day. Many engineers, executives, accountants, even just refinery workers fired overnight because of suspected ties to the coup. And of course, this is when efficiency and oil productions are plummeting, because you can't just fire 18,000 of your best people and expect things to go smoothly. So there's ensuing protests and strikes, and the whole year of 2002 is a complete shit show. The lines you see there'll be like entire days where there's no oil in the gas stations, or I'm sorry, yeah, gas in the gas stations. And it's never clear if at that particular day it's because of a strike within PDVSA or because of all the lost productivity of the 18,000 engineers and oil workers and such that were fired. So just complete and total disaster. This is where I come into the story. I remember being 7 years old at the time. And because there's no oil, no one's going to school. So it's just like de facto lockdowns, right? There's nothing anyone can do. So we're just stuck at home in the playground or whatever. Little like 5-year-old girl walks up to me and she's like, "Are you with Chavez or with the opposition?" I'm 7 years old. I don't even know what those questions mean. Those words mean. So then I talk to my mom, and it's like, yeah, at this point, it starts becoming inevitable, even as a child, to be deeply involved in Venezuelan politics, because it's just everywhere. You're missing school. There's a protest every day, and you're like afraid to even go out. Crime starts to soar amidst this whole chaos because, people still gotta eat or whatever. So what are they gonna do? They start sacking and kidnappings, and it's a complete and total disaster. There is a provision in the Constitution that Chavez rewrote to oust the president by a revocatory referendum. So the opposition tries this. They need to collect 20% of the entire electorate in signatures, or 20% of the country's population, I should say, in signatures, which is an insane amount of people. Imagine, because remember, most people are not politically engaged. Even in the U.S., among the highest turnout elections, there's still like 56, 57% turnout. And that's among eligible voters. So 20% of the population signing a piece of paper is insane. But they do it. They get they pass the 20% signature threshold, and they have a referendum to oust the president. And it narrowly fails.
Well, as I've said, if you're going to rig an election, that's the way to do it. You have it by a convincing but not overwhelming. So 54 to 60% is good. But if you go up to 80 or 90, then it goes beyond belief.
Right. So, well, and it's the thing is, what's becoming increasingly apparent is that 46% number might just be legit, because Chavez is overwhelmingly popular with the poor and even with academics, and increasingly with some sort of delusional, lefty leaning middle class people who saw the coup and they're like, this is stupid. The whole country was in lockdown for almost a year. What are you doing? Your political ambitions are ruining the country. Let's just coalesce around Chavez, get him out in the next election, and move on with our lives. And that becomes a sort of increasingly common middle class opinion. Whatever, I'm done with politics, just move on. And a lot of that bloc votes for Chavez. So I have absolutely no trouble whatsoever believing that 54% of the country was convinced by Chavez and wanted to keep him in power.
Okay, fair enough. That's probably the case then.
Yeah. Chavismo in action. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worth looking at the insanity of Chavez's policy, because it leads us to where we are today. And again, we mentioned this before the stream when we were talking, but a lot of people will blame U.S. sanctions. A lot of people will blame geopolitical factors outside of Venezuela's control. A lot of people will blame the brain drain out of Venezuela as reasons for the collapse of the country. And all of those have contributed. I think it'd be stupid not to admit that. But I would say still 80% of the fault actually just lies with how stupid, illiterate, and incompetently implemented Chavez's policy was. And there's 4 aspects of that policy that I think are the primary drivers for the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. And I'll do a minute on each. Bans on exchange of foreign currencies. Basically, you can't buy US dollars or euros unless you ask the government, and they can give you $500, which is nothing. Price controls, because things are getting too expensive. So then they just fix a price and
that just
say that
causes
everything has to be sold
massive
that way.
shortages, I would assume.
Right. Yeah. Then there's currency redenomination. That's a doozy. I'll talk about that later. And then expropriation of businesses, which we already talked about. So if you can go next. The first two are the ones, the real drivers of inflation before 2007. The first is currency controls. As I mentioned, Chavez is convinced that the coup attempt in 2002 was orchestrated by the CIA. I suppose it's not unreasonable to believe that, given the involvement of the U.S. You could take it or leave it, but basically Chavez goes scorched earth in the U.S. and decides that the best way to hurt the U.S., because, how does the U.S. get their power? From the U.S. dollar, and its use as a global exchange currency. So he basically bans that. He bans Venezuelan citizens from obtaining American dollars, unless they go through a government application and they can get $500 at a time, usually per year, which is insane because Venezuela produces nothing except oil and maybe like a few agricultural products like cocoa beans and coffee.
And oil is traded in USD.
Yes. Well, but I mean, it's the government who does that, so it doesn't really matter to the average citizen.
Yeah. Yeah.
What ends up happening is that, let's say your car breaks down, you need a piece. Nobody manufactures that in Venezuela, so you have to import it from abroad. That's bought in US dollars. Let's say you want to buy a computer. Nobody makes computers in Venezuela, so you have to buy them from abroad in US dollars. And you can see how most of the modern economy of Venezuela is powered by conversion to US dollars. Many businesses, stores, and corporations would just go to a bank and be like, hey, here's 2,000 Venezuelan bolivares, give me $1. Or, whatever the exchange rate was at the time. And then they would use those dollars to buy toys or car supplies or computers,
toilet
whatever,
paper.
right? Well, at the time there is toilet paper being made in the country.
Okay. So that was before the great toilet paper shortage.
Right.
Was China just not available to buy stuff from, or did China just like, I don't want anything to do with these guys, or?
This was 2002. I don't think.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
China was
makes sense.
quite as widespread and like powerful as it is now. So most, especially because these are not like this is not the government buying these things. These are private businesses. It's like, oh, I own a computer repair shop. I need GPUs or whatever. I'm gonna buy them from Best Buy in the U.S. and sell it at a markup in Venezuela. So of course, banning the U.S. dollar for everyday citizens, unless you apply for, if you run a computer repair business, $500 doesn't even get you one computer.
Yeah.
So if you're limited to one application for $500 in a year, you're not getting shit. So then, of course, what this creates is an incentive for black market U.S. dollars. And this is where you get a massive divergence between the official inflation rate and the actual inflation rate. Because let's say and this is actually fairly common in Latin American countries, people will buy US dollars as an investment. You know how like people in America will buy, like stocks
Bitcoin.
or gold or whatever. Right. In Latin America, and especially in Venezuela around this time, people would buy American dollars because it's actually a really good investment. It's, an asset that everybody in the world wants that roughly retains its value because it doesn't inflate anywhere near as rapidly as other currencies. And you can buy your things from abroad. So let's say I'm a private businessman who owns 50,000 US dollars just as like an investment that I made back in college. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, I can sell those 50,000 because the official exchange rate is 2,000 Venezuelan bolivares for $1 US dollar. They start selling them for 3,000 to one, and that's a 50% markup or whatever. All of a sudden, you get a 50% return on investment. So this begins an escalation because people have to buy the US dollars if they want to keep their businesses afloat, right? So then they'll start paying the $3,000 instead of 2,000. And then eventually, when that becomes a new normal, somebody realizes, oh, I can make a lot of money here. I'm going to sell it for 3,500 Venezuelan bolivars, and so on. And what you get is, in the span of like 5 years, massive inflation of the value of the US dollar in Venezuela. So then the official inflation rate is still 2,000 or whatever, the official exchange rate is still 2,000. So the inflation rate statistics are fine, but the real sort of black market inflation rate is like 200-300%. And the government is completely, I don't know if oblivious to all this, they had to have known that this was happening, but does not act officially. So this is where inflation really starts to pick up and where you get the next thing, price controls. Because all of a sudden, any imported goods, especially food stuffs, there's a lot of food that's imported from abroad, especially from Colombia and Mexico in Venezuela. Because people can't get a hold of U.S. dollars, or they can only afford them in really expensive quantities. A lot of businesses just can't stock things if they're imported. So there starts to be shortages or price gouging of basic food products. So Chavez says, 5 years ago, you used to be able to buy a whole chicken for, let's say, 10 Venezuelan bolívares. Now these greedy businessmen are selling them for 30 Venezuelan bolívares. This is an example of capitalism and neoliberalism and class warfare. So, of course, what does he do? He says, now you can only sell a chicken for 10 Venezuelan bolívares. And people are like, okay, Rita, but it cost me 20,000 to even generate, to even get a chicken on the stores. How am I supposed to sell it for 10 and make a profit? And of course, there's no response to that because they just want, their political enemies and their class enemies to suffer. So then you start getting massive shortages of basic goods and all sorts of goods, be they basic food products or higher end goods. So you can go on. In response to the insane inflation caused by these two combined measures, Chavez has this brilliant stroke of genius that to this day baffles international observers everywhere around the world. Because inflation had gotten so high, the denomination of Venezuelan bolívares was in the thousands, right? So instead of having a $50 bill or whatever, you have a $50,000 bill, right? Mm-hmm. And these numbers were getting exorbitant. And there's a lot of the economically illiterate masses would say things like, this used to cost 1,000, now it costs 10,000. The price has gone up so much, it's ridiculous. Look at all those zeros. What's Chavez's idea? They're gonna redenominate the currency by saying, if it said 5,000 before, now that's just 5. If it says 50,000,
Zimbabwe did that too.
And it's like, how is that supposed to help? You're just calling it a different number. You're not actually changing any of the underlying economic problems that are causing the inflation.
Sorry, just someone from the chat says the greedy businessmen were Chavez's buddies as they were the only ones who had access to abundant USD. So I guess maybe that's why they let it going, because Chavez and his buddies were engaging in the price gouging with USD because they weren't subject to the same restrictions.
It's entirely possible, and I'm sure some of that did go on, but you'd be surprised just how much money there was in Venezuela in the 2000s, how much people were spending on US dollars. But yeah, that could be part of the reason why they didn't do anything about it. But anyway, so how does he go on about this? He redesigns the entire currency and prints the entire supply of Venezuelan bolívares in one go, so everyone can have the new bills in hand. So you are doubling the money supply in a year.
They didn't get rid of the old ones?
They phased them out, right?
Okay.
So the plan was to eventually it'll be back to just the normal amount of currency. So you could trade in your old bills for the new ones. It's kind of how they did it. But it still took a lot longer than the government expected for people to turn in their money, because they weren't just about, and it's one of those things where it's like, well, I'm not going to give them my money. Is one of the things people used to say. So then for a while, you did have both sets of currency floating around. Did not go as planned. The money supply, well, not exactly doubled, because again, some people did turn in their money to trade it in for the new bills. The money supply was still massively increased, so they ended up having to print way more of the new denominations than they expected. So it was basically just a total disaster. They print a shitload of money. There's also the beginning of accusations of Satanism among the Chavista elite. The reason why, and if you'll take a notice, some people will just call this like DEI, affirmative action type stuff, but Look at the six figures in those bills. Three of them are, like normal looking, sort of like historic Latin American figures. Then there's three very obscure figures: a black man with a bandana, an Indian with a feather in his back, and then this sort of like socialite, elite type lady. These are allegedly historical figures in Venezuelan history, and Chavez just is like, well, it's still my job to educate you that you don't know the real history of black and indigenous and female contributions in Latin American history. But people quickly realize that they look an awful lot like the three powers in Santeria. This maybe requires a bit of an explanation, but I'll keep it short. The Spanish Caribbean, obviously, as I mentioned, very large black population, African slaves imported primarily Igbo and Yoruba ethnicities from Nigeria and West Africa in the 17 and 1800s. They bring with them their indigenous or traditional tribal religions. And yes, they are converted to Catholicism, but many of them keep a sort of syncretic version of their old religions where they just say, oh, this old god of war, this old goddess of fertility is just, I'm actually just worshiping this one saint. So they manufacture a new pantheon of allegedly Catholic saints that they worship. And this, over the course of 300-400 years, has developed into a very influential religion in the Afro-Spanish Caribbean, especially in Cuba and the Dominican Republic, called Santeria. It is believed that Chavez, in being involved with all these Cuban revolutionary groups, was exposed to Santeria and actually converted to it in around 2002. Because he started talking a lot about the three powers, and he started talking about how praying to the saints, as he calls them, would bring great wealth to Venezuela. And lo and behold, when he prints the new money, he puts figures that look suspiciously like them on the money.
So
people call this
is that
satanic.
Different from voodoo?
It is tangentially related to voodoo, but it's like distinctly Hispanic.
Okay, so voodoo is French, and voodoo is like the Spanish version of it, kind of. Very roughly.
Yeah, Santeria. Yeah, you could basically call it that. It's a little bit more like triracial. It's not like exclusively black. There's also like an Indian component to it. There's a sort of like a lot of, especially in the Spanish Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, a lot of the early settlers were like crypto Jews and Muslims.
Right.
Who are fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. And they also figure a little bit into the what will become Santeria. So it's a lot more syncretic and has many more influences, whereas voodoo is like just straight African religion in French.
Right.
So the last and most egregious of the economic policies that destroy Venezuela, and we already mentioned it, was expropriations. Put a link to a YouTube video. Wouldn't have to watch it right now. It's in Spanish anyway, but Chavez becomes increasingly deranged in blaming the fallout from his insane economic policies on the rich. Because he doesn't want to take responsibility for it. Why would he? He can get away with just blaming his enemies. And increasingly deranged moves, he just starts outright expropriating everything he sees. And I mean that quite literally. Like, and that's what the video is. He would just show up to random spots with like a camera crew to like a random square in Caracas and be like, what business is that? It's like, sir, that's a jewelry store. Okay, expropriated. That's mine now. Or, oh, what's a building over there? Oh, yeah, that's the headquarters of a major bank. Headquarters of what? That's mine now. Expropriated. And he would do this. Like, people would find out that their businesses or companies have been expropriated by watching national television. There wouldn't even be like a communication. It's like, hey, your assets are forfeit or whatever. It's like, no, it just happens, and there's no communication. There's no official legal process. Again, it's just like, oh, you're a political enemy, I dislike you. Or even it's like, oh, I like the way that looks, expropriated. To the point where expropiase, which is sort of like his catchphrase as he says that.
Is that like the Latin American equivalent of you're fired?
Yes, actually. It's a lot like that. And he becomes sort of like Chavez's catchphrase to the point. This is 2008ish, so this is when really like memes start picking up in on the internet. A lot of early Venezuelan Facebook memes are Chavez pointing at things and being like expropriacy. So yeah, I mean, needless to say, like, no, the government does not actually have the capacity to run 2,000 businesses as they just randomly expropriated. They don't know how to run them. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the human capital. So a lot of these businesses just sit there with no operations. Jewelry stores, that was a particularly egregious case. He just like randomly expropriated a jewelry store. The owner had no recourse, no way to get his money back, and he was actually quite in a bit of debt. And this jewelry store just sits there for months because no one operates it, no one knows or wants to operate it. Eventually, it just gets looted by random criminals who sell the gold in the black market. And this is just the economy of Venezuela. In case you couldn't tell, this is when people start to leave. But before we get to that, I also want to point out a lot of Chavez's, in addition to his failed economic policies, he also starts flexing his power. I mentioned already that he changed the name of the country. He also changed the flag and the coat of arms. He just randomly like changes the shade of blue and that's another star because fuck you, that's why.
It looks very it looks very similar, other than the blue and the star.
Yeah, it's literally the exact same flag. He just added an 8th star. The 7 stars represented originally it's kind of like the U.S. where like the 7 original provinces of the country. And he's like, well, but this doesn't include the indigenous peoples, or he comes up with some bullshit excuse, and boom, another star. It's basically just to flex his power and be like, I can change whatever the hell I want. There's nothing you can do about it. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the coat of arms. He changes the direction that the horse is facing. Now he starts galloping to the left, which is supposed to be like the revolution. We're like running towards socialism of the 21st century. He also starts putting lots of like just random Indian symbols. There's a very strong like anti-colonial push in a lot of his rhetoric. He changes the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Resistance Day. And he basically says that European colonialists have no place in Venezuela. So, of course, many of them started to leave. You can go next. This is one of the more egregious ones. This is around the time, I don't know if you remember, the National Geographic comes up with that some bogus reconstruction. It's like, oh, this is what Jesus' face could have looked like. Mm-hmm. And it's just like some random excavated body from like Roman Palestine. It's like, oh, this could be anyone. He takes notes from that, and because people were saying Bolivar was nothing like what you're saying he was. So then he excavates his body from the grave and pays some sort of reconstruction artist to reconstruct what he would have looked like, and he would have been like, yeah, actually, you know what? Bolivar was indigenous like us, and he actually changes his facial features, and this becomes the official portrait of Simón Bolívar. In like to this day, any official communication from the presidential palace has a Venezuelan flag and this exact reconstructed portrait of Simón Bolívar with Amerindian features.
Because wasn't he like maybe 1/16th or something? Like, if at all.
I'm sorry?
If he had indigenous, wasn't it like 1/12th or 1/16th or some like really small amount? If he
well, the thing is, we actually know because he was the grandchild of, on all 4 sides, peninsulares. So if you look at the caste system in Latin America, in colonial Spanish America, there were sort of like the usual race-based castes, like the criollos were the whites, and then the mestizos were the mixed white and Amerindian or whatever, and so on. There's actually a caste above that, which is the peninsulares, the peninsular, in reference to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. Just being born in Spain put you in a league above the rest, and you're basically immune from the law. All 4 of Bolivar's grandparents were peninsulares, and in fact, Bolivar is not even a Spanish name; it's a Basque name.
Weren't the Basques kind of an elite in the New World colonies?
Yes, and in fact, there's more Basque descendants in Venezuela and Colombia combined than there are in the entire Spain and France combined. Because they were sort of like a repressed linguistic minority in Europe. Nobody wanted them. They're not seen as like fully Spanish or whatever. But all of a sudden, in the New World, they were an elite because they were born in Europe, they were white, and they were Catholic. So they go sort of from destitute, poor peasants in the Basque country in Spain to being a rich elite.
I don't think
Latin
that's
America.
really true. My understanding is the entire Basque nation was granted Hidalgo status because they were considered to be racially pure since Islam never took it over.
Yes, and that's all the parts of Spain that didn't have extensive Islamic conquest were immediately granted the right to go to Latin America, and that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Where in Spain they were not a very high status, but all of a sudden, because of the imperial policies of Spain, the Basque are uniquely an elite above the rest. Precisely for that reason, because they're in northern Spain, so it wasn't just the Basque. There was also the Galicians and the Asturians and other people in the very far north of Spain were given this status. But the Basque were sort of like the biggest contrast in why they became such a diasporic people in Latin America, because they had such a high status granted to them by the Spanish crown in the colonies. But yes, so global communism. Enough about Chavez, and let's talk about more recent stuff. So, and this is where perhaps a lot of people are going to give you shit. Maybe people don't want to call it communism, whatever. At some point, you got to realize that these people are third worldists, and their aim is to destroy Western civilization. That's what communists are. That's what communists do, and that's what their networks are intended to facilitate. There's Cubans, there's Russians, there's Baathists, there's Chinese, there's all sorts of power players now in Venezuela, in the Western Hemisphere, that didn't used to be there 20 years ago. It's all because of Chavez. And obviously, yes, there were always Cuban networks or whatever, but Chavez gives them a lot of power and wealth because of all the oil that he's giving them. So at first, Chavez, having a cult of personality, would go on what they call cadenas. He basically would take all the national radio and TV stations and say, you have to broadcast me speaking. There's nothing you can do about it. And he would just talk. Imagine like if Trump took over like CNN and Fox News or whatever, and then for 9 hours, you just had to watch a Trump rally.
Yeah, isn't that like a thing? Like, didn't Castro used to do like 6-hour speeches or whatever?
Yes, I mean it's very common in communist culture personality. They would monopolize the state media so that you were always consistently exposed to his talking points or whatever. Mm-hmm. Eventually, people get tired of it, and just private television networks like Balloon. Before, public television actually used to be very well respected in Venezuela. Now everyone's sick of it, so everyone's just tuning into DirecTV or the internet or whatever. So Chavez takes this to the UN General Assembly and starts giving his long-winded speeches in front of the entire world. This is where those very infamous clips of him calling George Bush an alcoholic and dubbing him Mr. Danger come from around this time. There's a very infamous speech at the UN General Assembly where he begins by saying, "Do you smell that? It smells like sulfur because the devil was just here." Of course, talking about how...
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Wow, that was a blast from the past. I hadn't thought about that in years.
Very iconic moment in Venezuela. This is also... I can't remember if it's the exact same speech or if it's another one, but around the same time, he also has a 10-minute rant about the satanic state of Israel, which is why a lot of people in the dissident right seem to like him. And he basically puts a curse on them on the UN General Assembly. He does like a voodoo thing. He's like, "Curse you, state of Israel, may you burn forever," and whatever. And it's just like, people are just like watching in disbelief. And the reason why he does this, I can't remember if it's the next slide or the one before. Yes, is the Ba'ath connection. I'm not going to give the whole context on Ba'athism and Arab nationalism. It's a whole shit show. That could be like another 20-hour stream for all I know. But basically, there are Soviet-funded factions within Arab nationalism that become especially prevalent among the religious minorities of the Levant, especially the Shia and the Druze. become extremely influential power players in secular Arab politics because, of course, they don't want Sunni nationalism. They're not Sunnis. Among them was Shibli al-Asyami, I think is his name in Arabic. He is a Druze mercenary and personal bodyguard to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He is deeply involved in the Lebanese civil war and is eventually exiled to Latin America. He lands in Venezuela, where he has a son. His son rapidly, is connected to that same Soviet network of spies and infiltrators that has connections with the Che network and with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and with Cuba, of course. So he rapidly rises to power within Chavez's party, and because of the family connection, gets Chavez directly in touch with Saddam Hussein. So when Bush topples Saddam Hussein and kills him, Chavez takes it personally and becomes very involved in Arab politics for absolutely no reason other than to avenge his friend and advance his network of global communism. So this guy's son, Tarek al-Aissami, becomes vice president under Maduro eventually. He rises to the top and is sort of circulated around elite circles. Sometimes he's in banking, sometimes he's in direct politics, sometimes he's just sort of moving money around. Eventually, under Maduro, he becomes vice president and connects Venezuela to a network of human traffickers. This is around just after the Syrian civil war. And there's, infamously, everybody knows the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. What people don't recognize is that there's a Latin American element to the human trafficking that went on there. Because yes, Syria is another country kind of like Venezuela that collapsed and had a massive brain drain and population flight or whatever. But that wasn't even actually the majority of people who actually ended up entering into Europe. There were lots of Africans, lots of Afghanis, lots of Pakistanis and other people from all over, like the Middle East and North Africa and whatever and beyond, who were smuggled by networks controlled by ISIS and other terrorist groups into Europe. Because of the Tarek al-Aissami connection, some of these people are also given Venezuelan passports and they can claim asylum all over the US. And in fact, to this day, Tarek al-Aissami is the architect of, and people have seen Haitians and Afghans and Pakistanis and whatever at the US border. How the hell did they get there? Well, obviously it's a human trafficking operation and people will blame NGOs. Few people know that many of these people are given Venezuelan passports because of this guy.
Interesting.
Right. And it sort of gets me to the whole third worldism or whatever thing where people say Putin base or whatever. Putin's doing the same thing, where he's sort of using Europe as a dumping ground for his malcontents and his own refugees or whatever, and just dumping them into Europe and causing civil strife and turmoil or whatever because he benefits from that.
Someone's asking if Soros was involved with all this.
It's not been confirmed. People have alleged it. It's not entirely clear. I'm agnostic on the question. I could see it happening, but there's no... The thing with Soros, though, is that he's part of the Jewish NGO network, which is sort of opposed fundamentally to this. These are more like rival factions, so I don't... Maybe he benefits from them, and there's a lot more overlap in the gray area, with NGOs and stuff, because it's also muddy and it's impossible to trace. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were some incidental cooperation between secondary players connected to both. But I don't think there's direct involvement because he is very much connected to Zionism in Israel, and these people are anti-Zionists. So I'm actually not sure that there's a direct connection. Cuba and the KGB connection. We've talked about Cuba extensively here, maybe not as much as I should have, because they really have been instrumental. In fact, and this is where Maduro comes into the picture. Maduro, and I'll talk about him more later, was... excuse me, I'm having some water.
No problem.
Maduro was a nobody until he was recruited by communist militias in Venezuela taken to Cuba and trained as a revolutionary. That's actually how Chavez met him. He met him in Cuba. So there's a lot of training in weapons directly from the Soviet period that remain in Cuba. And those networks remain strong to this day because, of course, a lot of the Russian oil companies are all run by KGB or former KGB agents. So because of this Cuba connection, Venezuela becomes very entangled with Rosneft and Gazprom, which are the two main Russian oil companies. As American oil developers start pulling out in face of the expropriation because they don't want to be next to lose all their investments and stuff, Russian oil oligarchs come in and take control. And I mean, it's just a disaster. Igor Sechen's this guy. He former KGB agent, speaks like 7 languages like Portuguese, Arabic, Spanish, whatever. He is now the head of Rosneft and is basically running the Venezuelan oil industry. So a lot of the OPEC oil policy is actually secretly dictated by this guy. So there's a lot of Russian subterfuge in the oil market because they directly control Venezuela and its oil reserves.
And I think for most of the time, they haven't been the largest oil producer for most of the 20th century, I think.
I'm sorry, I missed that a little bit. I was reading the chat. Maybe I should stop doing that.
No, I do that a lot too. I think Russia was the biggest oil producer for most of the 20th century. I could be wrong, though.
Well, yeah, Russia themselves are incredibly oil wealthy, and that's why they're Gazprom and Rosneft and all these other companies are so fabulously wealthy and well connected. So what I'm saying is more the Venezuelan oil policy is not even directly dictated by Venezuela, even though it's a state-owned company. It's actually mostly run by foreign actors, primarily Russian, because they're the ones who actually operate the thing. So anyway, the great exodus. Sorry, I just had to do it. The first wave of people to leave the country were people like me. We were supposed to be the sort of relay generation for all the engineers, lawyers, and doctors, right? Upper middle class, college educated, parents and grandparents were college educated. This is, the backbone of any economy, the productive people who actually make the roads and make the roads work and carry out the infrastructure projects and make sure all the legal burden is taken care of and that people aren't dying from diseases. This class of people, especially the young, because if you're wealthy in Venezuela, yes, life is awful, but it's still decent enough that if you don't go into the bad parts of the town or whatever, you can live fine. But your children, you can see the writing on the wall for them because there's no opportunities for them. It's likely that if they try to start a small business or whatever, or a venture of some kind, they're going to have it expropriated by the government. So many people start sending their children abroad. First, as I mentioned, there's a lot of European immigration in the second half of the 20th century. Because of declining birth rates in Europe, a lot of those countries have very generous return policies for ethnic. Say, for instance, Italy. Italy has an extremely generous policy. If you have one Italian grandparent, you're allowed to return. You have permanent legal residence in Italy and a pathway for citizenship. So the first people to leave are those people who can leave through right of return. A lot of people go to Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, Hungary that way. A lot of people, there's also a fairly large Puerto Rican immigrant population in Venezuela, or was historically. So many people with that background, mix or full, would go to the United States because they had right of return through their grandparents. Mm-hmm. So what happens? Everything goes to shit because, the first generation of engineers and such to set up the infrastructure in Venezuela were in the 50s. The second generation, the first relay generation, were trained in the 80s and 90s, came in the 80s and 90s. The next generation would have been coming in around this time, early 2010s. In fact, I myself was going to be a chemical engineer down there and work in petroleum. That's sort of the path that I was going in. And, I left, like many people. So, of course, now you have, it's interesting. I put a picture there of the hydroelectric dam. This was built in the 1960s. Despite Venezuela being very oil rich, most of its power actually comes from hydroelectric and geothermal.
That's common, I
This is
think,
just
in most of Latin America. I think
yeah,
because of the
yeah. Well, just because
mountains.
there's right, like the geography is perfect for it. So in the 1960s, they built what was at the time the largest hydroelectric dam in the entire world, actually. La Represa del Guri, it's called. One of its transformers breaks, and all of a sudden, the country's out of power for like 8 hours, and nobody knows what the hell's going on. This is the first. I remember this very distinctly. I was in 8th grade. This is 2008. Power goes out at like 3 p.m. just coming back from school. Oh, that sucks. And at this point, like blackouts, like rolling blackouts, it's like, oh, whatever, power's out. It happens every other month or whatever. It's fairly common in Latin America. But then it'd been like 7 hours and the power wasn't back, and it's like, what the hell is going on? Eventually, power came back at like 2 a.m. And that was the story. A giant thing broke, and there was nobody in the plant who knew what broke or how to fix it, because people have started leaving the country. And this becomes an increasingly common sight. There's cholera outbreaks because there's no sanitation work being done on the water. Just shit like that. All over the country, stories in health, stories in law, stories in engineering and infrastructure, studies in education. That becomes the country when the first generation of people starts to leave, which are the professionals. And then Chavez dies. Mysteriously, in 2013, he gets cancer, and within 3 months he's dead. Total shock. Well, no, and it's, to be fair, like, it's very likely legit, because Chavez had been missing for increasingly long periods of time. They're like, oh, he's getting medical treatment in Cuba. It's like, why is he getting medical treatment in Cuba?
Like, didn't he live an extremely unhealthy lifestyle? Like, he was really obese, wasn't he?
Yes, he wasn't super obese at first, but eventually, yes, and you can see in these later pictures, once he's going through the chemotherapy, he's like 200 pounds or 300 pounds.
Yeah.
But he just disappears from like 2011 to 2012. He was gone for like a good 3-month period. Nobody knew where he was, and the official line was, oh, he's in Cuba, he's getting medical treatment. Medical treatment for what? It wasn't really clear until one time he came back in like late 2012 with a shaved head. And people were like, huh, what happened? Oh, yes, chemotherapy. And people were like, what? Turns out he had cancer for a lot longer than he had let up. And in 2013, he just died, sort of shocking everyone. And of course, it's kind of like, I mean, it's hard not to draw the distinction because it's so recent, right? But like the whole, like, Joe Biden just randomly, out of nowhere, drops out in spite of everybody thinking that he wasn't going to do it. And they just install his vice president as the interim in the election. And people are like, well, nobody likes you. Why are you here? That's almost word for word exactly what happens, except Biden may or may not be dead. Chavez actually died.
I think I was just looking it up. So I think he didn't do it in public, but Chavez was a lifelong smoker.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So apparently he was a teetotaler in public, but I don't think he drank alcohol. I just looking it up on Google. He might have just had lung cancer. So that's, once again, it's probably not a conspiracy at his age, his weight, and
right
lifestyle. It's not like necessarily he was poisoned or something like that.
Yeah. Although, of course, when Maduro takes power, the first thing he does is accuse the U.S. of giving him cancer. In 2013, this is literally Maduro's first address to the nation. He accuses the CIA and Obama of having used microwaves to give Chavez cancer. So it kind of tells you what Venezuela's in for.
Okay.
Eventually, the party.
Just Marabella says in the chat, he got surgery for prostate cancer in Cuba. They fucked it up and gave him, and it metastasized. And it like just went from there. That sounds very plausible.
Yeah, that's the official story, correct?
Oh, that's the official story. Okay, well, that sounds pretty likely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know how much they divulged it. That's like what the story is agreed to be now. I don't know if that was the official story at the time. Anyway, this is right before an election year, and there's a lot of shenanigans that go on in that election. Unsurprisingly, there's a very prominent opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, who was mayor of Chacao, funnily enough, like that Miss Universe earlier. Or of Miranda, I'm sorry, I think it's a different place, but very prominent local politician in an opposition heavy area. Because he is very charismatic and rapidly rises to the top spot for like contender for running against Chavez in 2006, they fabricate some bullshit charges against him and basically make it impossible for him to run for any public office after his term ends in 2006. He has like a 10-year ban on running for anything. So from 2004 to 2014, he can't run for anything. Well, what do you know? 2014 is the first election since Chavez died. So he rapidly rises to the top and just humiliates Maduro and other opposition candidates too. On television, he's just like talking about their failures, talking about how many people have fled the country already, how brain drain is going to doom Venezuela or whatever. So he takes it very seriously. And after completely humiliating Chavez and his party, he gets put in prison on more made-up charges. So he's disqualified from running, and they get this. You can go to the next slide. Maybe I'm a little bit out of order, but basically the 2013-2014 is the election season's complete pandemonium. Mass protests in the street, especially after they jail Leopoldo Lopez. They install this, like, the opposition rallies around this, like, very obviously controlled opposition, weak, quite possibly homosexual. It's not entirely clear. Might have been closeted, like, bachelor in his late 30s. Enrile Capriles Radonsky, famous for being the first Jewish politician, openly Jewish politician to run in Venezuela. But he later called himself a cradle Catholic. It's not entirely clear, but Radonsky is like descended from Holocaust survivors. He doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't have anywhere near the charisma or the command of the people or the vision to run against Maduro, who we can talk about him now. Born, unlike Chavez, who was born in sort of the first generation of the underclass out in the countryside to parents who taught illiterate children history or whatever. Maduro was born to revolutionaries and sort of like political activists in Caracas. His mom was actually Colombian, and it's disputed, but it's basically known that she was involved in FARC and other communist guerrillas in Colombia before moving to the U.S. Moving to Venezuela, and that's actually why she moved, because she was almost killed in a political confrontation. So raised by communists. In fact, some people, there's kind of like a birther conspiracy theories like, oh, Maduro was actually born in Colombia or whatever. There's no evidence of that, but it's one of those things where like I believe it, but there's not necessarily any proof of it. Kind of like people who say Obama was born in Kenya or whatever. Mixed race. He very strongly flaunts his Sephardic Jewish background, although he was raised Catholic. It's not entirely clear what his religious background is. But he's just fucking a schizo. He every once in a while will say, yeah, I'm now Hindu. I subscribe to this guru. And people are like, what? And then he's like, never mind, I'm not Hindu. I just really like the dude. And then he'll like go on these like random rants. Sometimes he's like, yes, I really respect the Prophet Muhammad. We praise and glory be to him. And people are like, not entirely clear what his beliefs are. He's kind of an idiot. If you listen to him speaking for more than 5 minutes, it's very clear that he's just not very smart, and that's actually kind of why he was picked. He worked as a bus driver in Caracas in these sort of like destitute communities. Eventually, he becomes a union leader for the bus drivers, and in the unions, he is recruited by this Cuban spy from the Politburo of the Communist Party of Cuba to go to the I forget what it's called. It's some sort of revolutionary school that they have for international agents. Basically, take him to Cuba for a year. They teach him this is communism, this is the Communist Manifesto, this is the history of like Stalin and Mao or whatever. Mm-hmm. Now go crazy. And they send him back to Venezuela, where he rapidly rises to the ranks of Chavez's party on account of being absolutely nothing other than his ability to suck up to others and to parrot communist propaganda. He's not very smart. He's not very competent. Nobody really likes him, but he's very loyal, and will just do and say whatever it takes to do whatever Chavez wants to do. So Chavez loves him, and when Chavez dies, he at the time was the vice president. It's sort of like a ceremonial position. The vice president doesn't really do very much in Venezuela. other than like if he wants, he has like control over the strings in the background. But you know, under a smart person, that would be a really dangerous post to have. But for someone like Nicolas Maduro, who wasn't actually doing anything, it's just sort of like a ceremonial position. Chavez dies and he becomes president, and pandemonium ensues because Chavez, for all his faults, was educated in the military academy. He knew things. He was very fluent in history, and he was very well connected to, you know, business leaders in Russia and politicians all over the Middle East or whatever. Maduro is just an idiot without an education, and what little was left of the economy completely collapses under him. You can go to the next slide now, or if you have something to say.
Nope, go ahead.
2013, 2014, during and after the elections, it's just like complete chaos. Those pictures of shelves with literally nothing on them, you know, after a decade of price controls and the issues with getting US dollars and all these things, there's literally just nothing to eat in the streets. It's really bad. I'll show some more pictures later, but basically the complete destitution of the Venezuelan people. This is when people really start to flee the country. Like you can't get rice or chicken or bread in the stores. There's like literally nothing. There's a very famous picture, like they walk in and the only thing they have is vinegar, because vinegar is sort of like a waste product, or acetic acid, I should say, is one of the waste products from petroleum. So some people say that maybe it wasn't actually like even food grade vinegar, and it was just like petroleum derivative that they had in the stores. And it's literally all they had. They had vinegar, they had oil, and they had nothing else in the store. Just absolutely like bizarre situation, which leads to these protests after, you know, Radonsky eventually, inevitably loses as a dispersed opposition. And, you know, a lot of people had posited this is obviously a fake election. Absolutely nobody liked Maduro, who's an idiot. Even the Chavistas thought he was bad. But then magically, you know, at the flip of a hat and at the middle of the night, Maduro goes from 40% of the vote to 50-something% of the vote.
Although, like, you said the opposition candidate was pretty bad, I think. So,
sorry?
Didn't you say the opposition candidate was really bad?
Well, the thing is, there was a really good opposition candidate that was jailed, and then the remaining, the opposition after that was sort of splintered. There was Krapilius Radonsky was sort of like the neoliberal, U.S.-affiliated, U.S.-backed one.
Right.
Soft power anyway. He didn't really go anywhere. There was Maria Corina Machado, who's more like explicitly conservative. Mm-hmm. She describes herself, she calls herself the Iron Lady. It's like she's really one of those like Thatcher wannabe people. Mm-hmm. So the opposition is just in shambles, because one thing to remember is that it's not like Bernie, like the election in 1998 when Chavez came to power wasn't like, oh, Bernie won the Democratic nomination and enacts socialist measures or whatever. No, it's like, I don't know, Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell are the Democrat and Republican nominees, and then all of a sudden you get like an Antifa, AOC, Stacey Abrams type of character win a three-way race. So that doesn't solely mean that the Democrats and the Republicans like each other. And throughout this whole time, part of the reason Chavez and his successors have been able to remain in power is because the opposition actually never really coalesced. There wasn't a united vision for, yes, we're going to be the conservative reaction to Hugo Chavez, or, oh, we're going to be the neoliberal American aligned reaction to Hugo Chavez, or we're going to be social democrats and we're just going to do away with the communist expropriation measures. No such consensus ever arises. So even to this day, the opposition remains disunited, and that's part of the reason why they haven't been able to coalesce around a single candidate. And whenever something like that did happen, like with Leopoldo Lopez, he was just put in jail. And I think it's, at this point, you know, we've been talking a lot about history, a lot about politicians, a lot about economic measures. I think it's important to recognize what this actually looks like on the ground and why people are fleeing the country in such insane numbers. These pictures were in 2017 at the height of, you know, one of those like, oh, oil prices came crashing down, so there's no state revenue for like 2 months. And several stores just outright closed because they have literally nothing to sell for months. And sometimes there'll be an announcement on the radio. It's like, oh, such and such supermarket has rice now. and there'll be like human stampedes of literally hundreds and hundreds of people running into the store. Some people would die just like trampled under others trying to get rice. There would be like fist fights over the last remaining bag or whatever. It was really fucking bad. It was just depressing. It's the type of thing that like shocks you when, you know, you grew up in a relatively like affluent country, and all of a sudden like you look at the news and it's like, oh, I haven't looked at Venezuelan news in a couple of years. What's going on? And you see like people getting run over and fighting over a bag of rice. It just fucking shocks you. Again, rolling blackouts. At one point, the hydroelectric dam is so completely out of commission that they don't have enough electricity to go around through the entire country. So what they end up doing is just like portioning it out and being like, this city is going to get electricity for these 2 days, and then this other city is going to get an electricity for another 2 days. And the government actually schedules it like this because they have no other way of producing the power that's necessary. Government offices are only open like 2 days a week because they don't have the capacity to keep them open. And yeah, like, and this only exacerbates certain problems, right? Like if you run a butcher shop, right? Like you sell meat, all of a sudden your meats are not refrigerated for 2 days out of the week. So then all your meat goes bad. Boom. That's another store that used to sell food that's now out of business because of systemic problems in Venezuela. There will be like water shortages. So like some cities literally would not have water. There was one that had no water for like 8 days in a row. So people just started shitting out on the street because they had no idea like how to flush their toilets.
Now, I had seen footage of, I can't find it now, but people were lighting cooking fires in apartment buildings.
Yes, this actually happened.
Okay. Did a lot of those buildings get burned down? Because that doesn't seem very safe.
I'm not entirely clear. I don't know the stories about it. And this is sort of the sad thing as an immigrant. It's eventually you just lose touch because you don't want to. It gets depressing seeing all these stories of insane shit that happens. It's like, oh, this mayor of a city just like got chased out by a left-wing paramilitary group at 8 a.m. in the morning in pajamas or whatever out of his house because he said something mean about the president on the radio the other day. Or, oh, the most insane one is because crime had gotten so bad. And I haven't talked a lot about the crime issue because, I mean, I could talk about my own personal stories, but the most insane one I heard was a friend of mine who lived in an apartment building. Mm-hmm. And, you know, relatively well off to do apartment building in a nice part of town or whatever. Not super wealthy, but decent, young professionals. Around 5, 6 p.m. when people were coming back from work, there were communist mercenaries with AK-47s just waiting for people in the lobby of the building. They would point a gun at them, tell them, go into your apartment, and then like they would go with them on the elevator, make them go in and just like take everything they want. It's like, oh, I like the television, I like that Xbox, ooh, I like the stuff in your fridge, and they would just completely plunder the entire apartment building. This went on for like several hours, from like 5 p.m. to like 1 a.m. in the morning, so till they plunder absolutely the entire every single apartment in the building. Televisions, computers, food, bed sheets, clothes, jewelry, money, everything. And the police had no because there's so much crime, they had no bandwidth to do anything whatsoever. And it's just, you know, like there's just another day in Venezuela. It's like, haha. I'm sure you've seen pictures of this. I even put some other pictures earlier. The money has become so useless under hyperinflation that people would just do origami and like arts and crafts with it. They just sell like, oh, look, here's a little crane. And the crane is roughly worth like 7 trillion Venezuelan bolívares or whatever, because of the insane denomination of all the bills put together. And it's like, yeah, that's about a day's worth of food.
They ran out of plastic to make passports.
Oh, that was one of the most insane ones. In 2017, I think it was. So many people applied to get a passport to leave the country that the agency that makes them actually ran out of plastic, so they couldn't make any more.
Have they tried to stop people from leaving the country at all?
They tried a couple times. There's an incident. Well, what they've actually tried more than letting people, stopping people from leaving, is stopping people from coming back. Bizarrely, there was a truck in, I think it was 2019, that, in one of these like insane crises, because, they just flare up every couple of years or whatever. There, a bunch of the countries, including their presidents, actually put together a little caravan of trucks filled with like non-perishables, shoes, clothes, bottled water, whatever, and just try driving the trucks into the country. And the Venezuelan military just shut them down, like straight up. No, if you go any further, we'll blow you up with a bazooka. And they actually positioned tanks and stuff to prevent the trucks from coming in.
Didn't they steal it and then sell the stuff themselves? It was something like that.
I mean, the government media wouldn't have published that, but probably yes.
Okay, I could be wrong. I remember something about that, but I don't remember exactly.
I mean, I don't think that was this particular case, but there have been lots of cases where, because with so many people abroad, people will send packages all the time with like cookies and tuna or whatever, just to their family, medicine, and a lot of the time the immigration controls people who like check the boxes and just steal everything for themselves. Political repression. I didn't want to include images of this for obvious reasons, but there's stories of journalists, private investigators, just general everyday citizens with a cell phone, like taking a video of something insane happening, who will get taken by, and I should mention, there's the Guardia Nacional is Chavez's, it wasn't established by Chavez, but he really like made it his own. It's a branch of the military. It's kind of like the Capitol Police, except Chavez increased them to be absolutely everywhere and to be staffed only with his people. And they basically just do the will of the party, or kind of like the, not the KGB, the
Praetorian
East German
Guard, or the Stasi?
Yeah, kind of like the German Stasi. Where it's like, oh, here, I heard that you uploaded a video of a riot against a certain politician onto Facebook. Come here with us for a second for a little questioning. And then they'll like tie them with their hands up so they can't do anything, and just like strip them naked, beat them, sodomize them with bayonets. And then they'll come back. There's one point, one of the guys was a journalist who was investigating a scandal with, I think it was cocaine being trafficked out of Venezuela by somebody high up in the government. So he went and investigated it. And they beat him so badly that he lost the ability to move his hands. And his wife had to give a press conference afterward because he literally could not speak or move at all. He was just completely incapacitated because of what they do to these people. Yeah, I mean, I could go on for hours about insane shit that happens, but at some point it just becomes another story, another statistic. So people just leave. This map I don't think is accurate anymore. The United States number alone has to be twice that, if you're counting legal immigrants. Because, mind you, these are the numbers of legal immigrants that have fled the country.
Oh, because I was thinking these were really low.
Yeah. Yeah, the number's at least twice that, especially Colombia, Peru. Yeah, it has to be more than that.
How bad does it have to be to flee to Peru? My understanding is Peru and Ecuador aren't very nice places. I could be wrong, though.
Ecuador's okay, but yeah, Peru's not great.
Okay. Or Ecuador has oil, right? Or am I misremembering?
I'm honestly not sure. I don't think so.
Okay.
If it does, it's not famous for it.
I mean, I get fleeing to Chile or Argentina, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I mean, I even know, I have a relative who moved to Nicaragua. Imagine things being so bad that it's like, oh, found a job in Nicaragua. I don't know anything about it. Country's probably a shithole. I'm going to move there anyway because it's better than this.
How bad are the cartels in Venezuela?
Ooh, okay. So what's interesting about drugs is that drugs were never a particularly like large problem. I mean, obviously they were, but not in the same level as like Colombia or Peru.
Is that because there's no money?
And
no,
it's I mean, not, especially
it's not on the traffic route to the U.S.
Right, maybe not exactly. It's not entirely clear why they never took hold. There's a lot of people say that there's just a very good anti-drug apparatus in Venezuela prior to the 1990s. that kept a lot of the really, really bad stuff out. And of course, drugs still rampant in the underclasses, as in anywhere in Latin America. It's really bad, but nowhere near the level of Colombia, where you have like, production of half the world's supply of cocaine, stuff like that. Like for a neighboring country, like it's surprisingly little relative to others.
My understanding is Nicaragua really doesn't have that much because the secret police or whatever, the Sandinistas, are pretty good at keeping out cartels.
Yeah, I mean, they're on the route. I don't know how good they are about keeping them out so much as like they probably just like, yeah, they pass through, but they don't like infiltrate too deep into the country. It's hard to say. The thing with a lot of this is like there's a lot we don't hear.
Right.
With drugs especially. That said, eventually drugs did become a bigger thing because of the FARC connection within the Chavista political party. To the point where there was a scandal. I didn't include it here. I just made like a quick reference to it at the end. In 2018, there's a scandal called the Narco Sobrinos, which literally translates to the Narco Nephews, where, Maduro's own nephews, two of them, two young guys, were stopped at Port-au-Prince in Haiti with 800 kilograms of cocaine by the DEA.
800 kilograms?
Yes.
Whoa.
Mind you, this is like, well, I mean, I was going to make a Joe Biden reference, but I guess his own son is involved in drugs and stuff.
How bad does it have to be that, like, the Haitians catch you? Like...
Well, it's the American DEA in Haiti.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Venezuela doesn't really produce the drugs, but because there's so much connection with, again, Afghan drug production and clandestine operations in Colombia with the FARC or whatever, like all these are part of the communist network that the Chavista party is associated with. So they're increasingly involved in trafficking it, even if they don't produce it. So yeah, this scandal, they were kept in an American prison until 2022 when Joe Biden traded them for like 5 Venezuelans that were stuck I'm sorry, 5 Americans that were stuck in Venezuelan prisons. If you can go back to that for a little bit.
This one?
It's funnily, this is the graph that Trump was talking about when he almost got shot to death. You can see 2021 where Joe Biden comes in. You see all that yellow, that's a growth in illegal immigration into the United States. The bulk of that comes, I'm not going to say they're all Venezuelans because, again, I did mention that there's a huge human trafficking operation that goes through Venezuela with Venezuelan passports. But an absolute majority of all the illegal alien encounters in the United States have been to people with Venezuelan passports. Whether or not they were actually Venezuelans is a different question. But it goes to show the magnitude of the problem between the illegal migration of actual Venezuelans and then the people who are being trafficked into that. And lastly, I just want to conclude with the thought that these people are not your friends. If you can go next. And I mean, like, this is almost pandering with how, like, oh, the inequality or whatever, but, like, it really is shocking that in the same country where you have all the things that I showed earlier of the, like the empty shelves, days without running water, you also have a new Ferrari dealership just opened a couple of years ago in the richest part of Caracas where all the Chavistas live, or all the government officials live. And you have people driving with Ferraris through like abject poverty. Or Lecheria, that town that I'm showing there, is basically Venice. It was built on a lagoon by the oil executives at PDVSA. And they don't even have cars, they have yachts and boats. And that's how they get around. It's like, oh, let's go get some dinner at the shrimp restaurant or whatever. Yeah, let's get on the boat. And then they'll drive the boat like it's a car. So these people live insanely extravagant lives off of the back of the petroleum money while all this shit is going on. So I can understand people who sort of see, oh, they're standing up to American imperialism. I can even understand people who are like, well, there's a growing faction with Russia and China or whatever, and that's the future of the world. And I can understand people who want to take that side geopolitically. That's one thing. If you're like a third worldist in the sense that you want to see the American State Department fail. I think that's foolish if you're an American, because these are still your enemies, and these are still, people bringing in drugs and illegal aliens and all sorts of problems into your country. But geopolitically, that's one thing. It's a very different thing, however, to say that these are good leaders that are taking good care of their country, and after, like years of repression and poverty, finally there's justice in Venezuela, because that's just simply not the case. I don't think anybody can, with a good conscience, see the state of the country and then see how these people live and say that these are good leaders that are fighting for their people, because they're just very obviously not.
So the counter argument I've seen, among other things, is gay marriage isn't legal in Venezuela and abortion is still severely restricted. So it hasn't, the social revolution hasn't gone as far there in that sense as it has in America.
Yeah, that's the thing is, these are old school communists. Che Guevara in Cuba, like, put homosexuals in jail.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, Fidel Castro and all these people, they put homosexuals in jail. Many of the people here, like Celia, I forget her name, the wife of Maduro. She calls herself, and some people say that this is why Maduro calls himself a guru aficionado or whatever, because she's like very into world religions or whatever, and there is a contingent of very strong like liberation theology Catholics, and as I mentioned, many evangelicals in the halls of power in Chavez. So these are not sort of like modern Reddit leftists who want to abolish the family, and so like they're very obviously not the Kamala Harris, Barack Obama faction of the international left, but that doesn't make them, again, your friends. These are still people who are just there to plunder, to punish what they perceive as their political enemies, and to get rich off of the backs of other. And the insane thing is that they call themselves revolutionaries, and it's like, you've been the party in power for 25 years now.
Like the institutional revolutionary party in Mexico with their, 60, 70 years in
power. Right. So
now, is that changing? Is that changing a lot? Like when they, because I'd imagine when they move to the next generation, they're gonna all be like more Reddit types, and stuff like that.
I mean, you see it somewhat, but the thing is, it's hard to predict because so many people of all political orientations have left the country that it's not clear what's even left at this point. I mentioned earlier that Venezuela is really two nations coexisting as one in the same land. And the top, mostly European descendant population are basically, for all intents and purposes, modern Europeans, right? Like they all party all day and all night. They do drugs, like insane rates of like LGBT identification. Most of them are atheists. Yes, that's kind of the elite that remains in the country, but they're not particularly numerous or popular, and most have left anyway.
Because it seems like in Latin America, what happens a lot is the elite get trained in America or Europe or something, and then they come back and they kind of impose this stuff, normally by judicial fiat. I think that's what happened in Colombia and a lot of countries, is the Supreme Court's just overturned. Like
that's certainly what happens in Brazil all the time.
Like I think in Colombia, the conservative government passed an amendment defining marriages between a man and a woman, and then the Supreme Court overturned it and said, okay, it's legal now. Gay marriage is legal now.
Yeah. Well, the reason, again, why I think Venezuela is different and a little bit unpredictable in that regard is because that used to be what happened. There used to be, most of the elite politicians or whatever were educated in Harvard or Cornell or, University of Toronto or whatever. Nowadays, a lot of the people who would have done that and come back and run the country just stay abroad now. So there isn't as much of a sort of leftist millennial, especially, push for these types of policies, because there's just no millennials. The brain drain has been so absolute in the country that there's no one to even bring that kind of stuff into the country anymore. So to the extent that there's social liberalism, it is just sort of like people are addicted to the internet because the reality in the outside world is too depressing. And if you look on Twitter, like a lot of Venezuelan accounts or whatever are like really into like that creepy like internet art. To not get into too many specifics side of things, just like shit lips who are like, oh, go for Palestine or whatever, because it's just the default culture on the internet now. But that's sort of like an organic development of people just becoming hedonists of their own volition. I don't think there's sort of like an institutional imposition of bad values, because there just isn't a millennial elite at all in the country. They've all left.
Because my understanding is, I think that a lot of the old school communists are moving in more of a kind of pro homosexual direction. Like, I think in in Cuba, they passed a constitutional amendment to get like that started, and I think in Venezuela they've started to do that. Abortion really seems to be a sacred cow in Latin America, even
Yes.
for leftists. I guess that's just a legacy of how Catholic they were. But I do find that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think abortion is just really unpopular. I remember back in 2008, we were in school. We were like in middle school or whatever, and one of the assignments for homework was to watch this movie about abortion, and how there was this girl who had been raped, and she didn't know what to do with the baby, and she almost aborted him or whatever. And in the end, there was just a couple that really wanted a baby, and they adopted the baby. And the moral of the story is like, as difficult as life can seem, there's always a more humane option. So the fact that even like, can you imagine an American public school having that as a homework assignment? Write a paper about this movie and about how bad it is to kill children. Like, it doesn't happen.
Well,
So,
probably,
and I don't
be
think
the opposite.
Right. So I just don't think you can make the case that that cultural paradigm is a result of government imposition, because you see it everywhere, regardless of political affiliation.
So, just going off of what people are saying in the chat, I feel like in a lot of cases, and I say this about the Communist Party in China, even if they might have inclinations in more of like a radical progressive direction when it comes to social policy, they understand what side their bread is buttered on. Like, the Chinese are a deeply conservative people, and they know they have to like pander to that.
Right.
And I feel like in Russia they tried to they said all the feminist stuff, but once again, Russian culture is very conservative. So I think in practice it was still very. I'm sorry for using the term patriarchal, but you get what I mean. Like if you look
totally,
at
100%.
if you look at the like actual people who ran the country, there was like no women, but there would be a very strong like, oh, we're a feminist country, we're equal, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, and remember, it's not just the Chinese and the Russians. There's also a huge Arab component to the Venezuelan international network. And if you think the Chinese and the Russians are patriarchal, man, I don't know what to tell you when your main partner in the Middle East is Iran. So yeah, I mean, that could be part of it. This isn't a question I ponder particularly that very much, just because I think it is ultimately more a cultural thing than anything else. I don't even know how much I want to talk about the 2024 election.
Also, just countries that have really bad education systems. The population can't read, but in some limited context, that's a good thing because they can't read Reddit then.
Yeah, true, accurate. And again, I think that we even mentioned that a little bit at the beginning, how, like there are countries like Argentina and Brazil that from the very beginning of the 20th century had very strong leftist movements because there was so much, Italian immigration and such. Because Venezuela was like an illiterate peasant society farming cocoa beans and coffee for the first half of the 20th century, there wasn't even an underclass literate enough to care or know about communism. So count your blessings, I guess. I don't know. Or choose your poison. Yeah. I don't know how much I want to get into the 2024 election because a lot of the facts are still sort of like disputed on the ground.
Now, I'm trying to remember, I don't know if it was the election before this one or 2 elections ago, but wasn't there a case where the opposition overwhelmingly won in like the congressional elections, so they invented like the constituent assembly or something? Like,
yes.
To basically replace it, and then they won like 100% of the seats.
In fact, I included that a little bit as a throwaway note at the end because I just said like shit I didn't even bother including. There's a giant list of things, and that was one of them. 2015, Maduro establishes a separate legislature after losing. Yeah,
because the opposition won like, I don't know if it was like a super. They won by a lot, And then they just made up the like completely different. I don't think it even still
They
exists.
had near. Yeah, the opposition had like nearly 80% of the seats in the National Assembly. Um, and yeah, that was in 2015. That's because the election had just happened in 2014, which was very obviously faked, and there were like insane protests. I mean, you can look up the videos from the 2015
Was that
protests.
the first one without Chavez?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
Yes. So literally everyone thought the election was fake. There were like massive protests, over 8 million people on the street. So it was like actually insane. Imagine if like 1 out of every 4 people in your country were out protesting in the streets after an election. That's kind of like the level of discontent that people had. So it's no wonder that the opposition won like over 2/3 of the seats in 2015, and it was so bad that he's just like, well, whatever. He just basically just created a second legislature out of thin air and said, this is the real legislature now. And the country has had basically 2 separate governments operating ever since, to the point where 2019, the following elections, the elections were declared illegitimate, and the leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, which is a name a lot of people know around these circles just because he's one of the more recent opposition figures to be propped up by the U.S.
Was he the one they recognized as president?
Yes. So because there's a clause in the Constitution that says if there is no legitimate precedent, the leader of the legislature, basically the Speaker of the House, becomes acting president until a legitimate election could be established.
Okay, so there actually is a legal base. Okay, because I thought it was just some random dude who they said was president. Okay, so there is actually an argument to be made. Okay.
Right. So the argument is the election was not legitimate, and therefore we cannot recognize Maduro as a legitimate president. Since there is no legitimate precedent, interim presidency goes to the Speaker of the House until elections can be held. And that's where they've been since 2019. It's been 5 years. And Guaido, to this day, calls himself the president of Venezuela. And the European Union still acknowledges him as such. Just bizarre, because he has no power, to actually like do legislation or do anything at all. Or levy taxes or do anything. He has no control over the military. But it's just sort of like the absolute like clown levels of...
like how a bunch of European countries don't recognize Putin as the leader of Russia anymore.
Right, kind of like that, yeah. It's just complete total gridlock.
How do you feel about him personally? I don't know a ton about him.
About Guaido?
Yeah.
I think he's emblematic of the sort of aimlessness and incompetence of the Venezuelan domestic opposition. Where, I mean, bless his heart, he's trying, but I think there just isn't... Because so many people have left, and overwhelmingly, of course, opposition, there's no political economy or appetite for a genuinely conservative politics of the kind that it would take to right the ship.
Because isn't he also, like, left-wing?
Yeah, right, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. So, within the factions of the opposition, he's still what would have been the Social Democrats back in the day.
Yeah.
These people have no... intention of actually cutting, welfare spending or reprivatizing or doing basically any of the major things that it would take to right the ship. And they do have some proposals, because as an opposition for 25 years, they've had to come together and negotiate and stuff. But they are fundamentally sort of like divided in ways that are unworkable. So what ends up happening is the only candidates that end up getting postulated for leadership in the opposition are sort of like the milquetoast centrists that don't actually have any strong convictions that anybody within the opposition coalition could disagree with. So then nothing gets done.
The Guyana escalation actually won the RG for third world nonsense of 2023. It's just the ultimate, like, propaganda. Everything's a disaster. Let's just invent some random nonsense to try to distract the public. Like, does anyone even care about that in Venezuela? Or is that entirely,
that was the funniest thing. I remember talking to my, because, I hear the news and I'm like, what the fuck? Are they actually going to start a war? That's insane. Sorry cursing.
Oh, no, it's fine.
So I called my grandma, who lives there, and I ask her, "Are you afraid? What's gonna happen? What's the feel in the air? What are people saying?" And people are like, "Oh yeah, no, it's theater. Nobody cares." What's funny is if you look at an official map of Venezuela from anywhere since, like, I think the 1930s or whatever, you'll see that the entirety of the Essequibo, which is like roughly 2/3 of the territory of Guyana, is labeled as territory in reclamation or proclamation, basically saying, yeah, we're in the process of getting this back, we just haven't done it yet. Now, the reason why is they inherited a colonial claim to the area from way back in the day. Like, the Spanish claimed the same area as the British and the Dutch did. And specifically, like, up to the Essequibo River, which is most of the country of Guyana. But because that was such an undeveloped, like, dense jungle, what they thought at the time was nothing of value. Now they're finding oil, of course. They never really bothered contesting the claim. And during the second half of the 19th century, the British import a lot of African slaves and later Indian indentured servants. So the culture there is completely different. The Hispanic population is like minuscule because they were never that big to begin with, and the country is dominated by Hindus, Muslims, and Africans, all of whom speak sort of like Creole variety of English.
Yeah, it's just, I find this is a thing in, like, third world countries, is they just come up with something really grandiose. Like, the Central African Empire might be the ultimate example of this, where they're just trying to distract the population. So, like, okay, we're going to reclaim, like, greater whatever, or we're going to bring back Babylon or whatever. It just seems really goofy.
Well, again, because they have absolutely no accomplishments to brag about when running for re-election or whatever, they stoke what little patriotism people have left. And the Guyana question is really funny. Can you go back a little, actually? Yeah, I want to talk about those numbers for a little bit. But because that actually kind of ties into this. What little patriotism is left is just, like, very stupid, sentimental. Like, I remember back in the day, Venezuela was the best country. And, people, again, have that complex with Simón Bolívar because he was, like, such a big leader in the movement for independence from Spain back in the 1800s. Venezuela has always had, like, a Napoleon complex of thinking it can punch above its weight, and pushes to stoke patriotism are always very militaristic, and we're like, oh, we have the strongest army, and look at how we defeated the Spanish and whatever, and this just sort of ties into that, where they're very, like, revanchist. There's some territory that they lost to Colombia after the secession from Gran Colombia that somebody wanted to contest for a little bit, that never went anywhere. But it sort of speaks to what the military especially thinks of themselves and, like, what the role of government is. And it's exactly ultimately what you said. It's like they have nothing to run on, so we're just going to, like, stoke patriotism by talking about how we're going to take over the world. And of course, there's also, like, a naked political calculation of, like, oh, they have so much oil. If we did it, we would get so fabulously wealthy or whatever. But there's a reason you haven't heard about it since October when it happened. It was just a lot of saber rattling, a lot of, oh, let's get people pumped to vote for us in July of 2024. And then you get this shit. Why don't you take a look at these numbers? 50-something percent, 40-something percent, and then 4.6. Oh, that's really weird. Why did all the minor candidates get exactly 4.6? What happened?
To be fair, the guy who knew how to do math led the country years ago. So this was the intern. This was, like, the intern from India. They, like, called some, like, I don't know, telemarketer in India. They had him do it.
Well, what's insane here is it's very obvious what they wanted to do, which is 51.2 plus 54.2 plus 4.6 adds up to 100.
Yeah.
So whatever the numbers are going to be, whatever the real numbers are, this was always the agreed upon result by the National Electoral Council from the very beginning. It was obviously rigged. But then what's funny is that they didn't realize that all others 4.6 meant that all others should add up to 4.6. So they gave each of them 4.6. If you add up this map, this adds up to like 132. Very obviously there's not 132% in an election. So it's just people started looking into it, and they counted the math. And this guy Daniel DiMartino, he's great. He's kind of like a neocon. He's kind of cringe sometimes, but he has some really good research. He's Venezuelan. I think he lives in D.C. He's policy. I don't know if it's the American Enterprise Institute or some others, or like neocon think tank. But he has a lot of connections in Venezuela, and when he posts about Venezuela, at least he posts very factual. Obviously, like, you know, there's a bit of like a bias in the way he presents his information, but the information itself is, I think, the most reliable. Because the thing is, because Venezuela is such a shithole with state-controlled media just pumping out propaganda, it's really difficult to get accurate information. And a lot of it is just like complete boomer garbage. You get, you know, one of those like forwards from grandma genre of content where it's like, oh, did you see they're going to redo the Trump election in 2020 because it was illegitimate? And it's like, grandma, no, that's not going to happen. You saw on Instagram that's not real. So you get a lot of just like totally fake BS on like Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook, and these are all sort of like the social media that Venezuelans use. So I always find it helpful when you can find actual like legitimate sources, and this guy's one of them. So if people want to give him a follow to get an idea of what's going on in Venezuela, I think it's helpful. He was one of the first people to sort of show the Cook numbers in that election.
So has half
Maria
the
Corina
world acknowledged them as the legitimate president? Or it seems to be like going back and forth very quickly.
Yeah, and again, this is why I hesitate to give details and predictions or whatever. Like, things are changing so rapidly in the ground. Like, there's insane protests already. Not as strong as they would have been 10 years ago because so many people have left who oppose the government. But it's not clear in which direction things are going to evolve. There's a lot of different factors at play. Like, is the U.S. State Department going to do anything about it? What's the official policy of the Biden administration? What does Trump want to do? Does he have a plan? Probably not. It's probably just going to be whatever Pompeo or whoever he ends up appointing as Secretary of State. So it's not clear how America will react. It's not clear how Europe will react. It's not clear how the situation is going to evolve just with so many people having left already. Or what the opposition's even going to do.
Well, once again, I get back, like, who's even in charge in the U.S.? Like, is Blinken going to figure this out? Is Biden? Is Dr. Jill? Is Kamala? Like, I don't even know. Well, no one knows who's even in charge of the foreign policy at this point.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's still the U.S. It's still... The CIA exists. The State Department exists. There are offices. There are people doing things. It's just that you and I don't know who they are. Maybe certain heads of state don't know who they are, but they exist. In Venezuela, it's not clear, number one, who the government even is anymore. Who's legitimate, who's not. There's no institutions to run things. There's no bureaucracy to process claims of fraud or, you know, legitimate justice system to adjudicate these types of things. I guess one thing I did want to talk about, going back to social liberalism, is I did mention that a lot of the sort of like upper class of Venezuelans were becoming increasingly socially liberal. Maria Corina Machado, who's supposed to be sort of she calls herself, again, the Thatcher of Venezuela or whatever, massive feminist. Venezuelan women might just be the most feminist anywhere in Latin America.
Really?
Even more so than Argentina.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's been like that for a really long time. I mentioned sort of the Miss Universe culture. There's also a like feminist counterculture to that, where, and it's not like, you know, like political lesbianism, shaved head feminism. It's more like girl boss, women can do anything, and be MBAs and high productive workers type of feminism. less Hillary Clinton and more Nikki Haley type feminism, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense.
And Maria Corina Machado is very much like, and that's part of why I think even the right in Venezuela has no teeth to actually do anything, because it's ultimately like they don't even realize that a lot of their social bullies are fundamentally leftist and in origin and orientation. And yeah, it's just a shit show.
So, what do you think the actual election results were? Because I could still see Maduro winning. The U.S. 60% thing is a little. I'm just not really sure. So, do you think it's possible that maybe the opposition won by like a couple percentage points, or they lost by a couple, or what do you think happened?
Exit polls had the opposition leader going up by like 60%. So that's probably actually closer to the truth. As we've mentioned before, Maduro is not believed to have won a single legitimate election. Because there's 2014, which is obviously like fraudulent, everybody that cried. And then he installed the fake. Well, let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because in 2015, there's a midterm election. Opposition gets like 70% of the vote. Then 2019, opposition wins, or again, cookbooks, opposition does not recognize. So was that a legitimate election? Probably not. Nobody trusts the numbers. And now this one, again, going by the margins that midterm elections go by, it's always between like 55 and 70%. So it'd be really surprising to me that, oh yeah, in legislative elections, people want the opposition, but in presidential elections, people really like Maduro. That doesn't make, that doesn't pass the sniff test. So I think it's very obvious in my estimation that there's fraud. Is it sufficient to rig the election? Probably.
It could be what I call overdetermined. Like, I think there is election fraud in Russia, but I don't think it matters, if that makes sense. Like,
sure.
I think Putin would still win overwhelmingly, but I think it's overdetermined to make sure that it's by a large majority for legitimacy purposes. I like there's some other countries like that, but I would tend to kind of take that perspective. Maybe that I think Maduro has a pretty high floor, doesn't he?
Well, and the thing is, yes, the reason why is because there's so many people who oppose him have left. Turnout is never particularly high in Venezuelan elections, and when it is, it's when the opposition wins. But when you have 7 million voters, all of whom hate the regime, gone, obviously that would massively tip the favor of the scales in the favor of the opposition. So the fact that that's a constituency that just cannot vote because it's really difficult to vote abroad and they wouldn't count your votes anyway, tells me that there is, as you said, likely a really high floor.
Also, just all the poor people who get
elastic. Gibbs. I'm sorry?
Also, just all the poor people who get Gibbs.
Even they have left, though.
Oh, okay.
At this point, I mean, yeah, like the absolute destitute poor who cannot even afford a bus ticket to leave, then yeah, those people stay. And many of those people might be voting for Maduro without even understanding that he's the cause of their problems or whatever because they're illiterate. But
no, but they might just see, Maduro gives us free shit, so we're going to keep supporting him.
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised how low turnout is even around those people. I think part of the demoralizing thing is the elections are just very obviously fake, and it's impossible to know what actually happens.
So people just don't even bother?
Yeah.
So it's a foregone conclusion. Although, yeah, because people are saying that the 60% opposition poll was something the U.S. made up, which is possible. Okay, so Argent in the chat is saying that the inflation rate has fallen to 50%. And we need to address that.
Well, actually, what's really interesting is actually the economy has stabilized in recent years, and you'll see that I did include a lot of economic indicators from the 2020s. Reason why is nobody even uses the Venezuelan currency anymore. The Venezuelan economy has been dollarized since roughly 2020. And I mean, like, people get paid in US dollars. And it's this bizarre situation where the government still tightly controls, allegedly, the money supply. But because there's so many people abroad, everyone just brings in remittances, like everybody has, knows, oh, I have an uncle whose brother lives in Miami and he gives in $200 every month. And, Venmo and PayPal and even Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have become a huge part of the Venezuelan economy. So because the economy is increasingly less reliant on that insane Venezuelan currency, things are actually stabilizing economically somewhat. Mind you, that's stabilizing around a much more destitute and diminished economy relative to what it was before.
I mean, 50%
2013.
inflation is still insane. Like,
I mean, 50% inflation, right?
like,
and it's kind of funny. It reminds me of, Biden trying to brag about how, yes, inflation was 8% at the beginning because of COVID, but now we brought it back down to 3%. It's like, okay, yeah, but those 2 years of 8% inflation still happened. It's relative to our starting baseline.
That didn't go down. Like, it's,
Right.
It's like, yeah.
Right. Well, so my point is the sort of annualized statistics are actually stabilizing quite a bit. And I think that's largely due to the dollarization of the economy. Because of remittances, but then also because the government has just stopped giving a shit and is like, yeah, what are those rules? We don't care. Just use dollars, and the entire economy happens sort of like under the table.
Right. So they're just trying to, I don't know, maintain power at this point, and everything else is secondary.
Basically.
Okay. Marbella says the dollars are free now, but they're difficult to obtain. Every once in a while, they flood the dollar market to prevent a crash. They say that the dollars come from drug trafficking.
I wouldn't be surprised if that are true, because another thing that's happened, and we haven't really talked about it too much, is oil production has completely cratered in Venezuela, which is really sad, right? Because it for all you could say, it still has the largest proven oil reserves in the world outside of like Antarctica. But because so many people have left, because the brain drain has been so complete, there's just like no one competent to operate the oil drills. So there's entire days where like refineries just don't have anything to do, or extraction and rigs and stuff, they have nothing to extract because they don't have people to operate the machines. And also, I mentioned earlier, Igor Senchin from Rosneft, the Russian company. It's kind of an open air secret that a lot of the Russian contractors that come into Venezuela just straight up steal equipment, not just for oil extraction, but even for like they go to gold mines and bauxite, and there's all sorts of minerals in the interior of the country that are just being plundered. But where else are we going with that? Oh yeah, the Russians are operating a lot of the oil extraction, and they're like hilariously inefficient because they can't communicate with the workers in Spanish, and a lot of the time they just end up stealing the equipment and leaving. So all that to say that oil production has, as I said, cratered in Venezuela, and they've taken to other routes. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of drug trafficking. I'm not super plugged into this news, again, because a lot of that comes from sort of the underground, like boomer WhatsApp messages of the world.
Is China getting involved in the oil industry there?
Not as much as you'd expect, actually. They obviously they have huge investments in Venezuela. They've not been paid very well in return. It's funny because the Russians actually have made back a lot of their initial investments. The Chinese haven't, and they're getting kind of impatient with Venezuela. Initially, they wanted to have Venezuela as a backup for oil importation in case, with the Strait of Hormuz or whatever, there's so many choke points that the U.S. could use against China to deprive them of oil. So they wanted
Right. Well, and the Venezuelan regime is desperate for anybody to back them up.
Right, exactly. So they did make a lot of investments around the 2013-2014 era when things were like at their absolute worst. But at the end of the day, that oil still has to go either through the Drake Passage or through the Panama Canal. So the Chinese aren't like super duper invested. And just because of how poorly and corruptly things are run in Venezuela, they haven't seen a lot of return on that investment.
Right. So I heard that, I don't know if you know anything about this, that Wagner is apparently showed up after the election to help the government maintain power.
Oh, I hadn't heard about that at all. I believe it.
Apparently, I've heard that has happened. That would be fascinating. As someone said, it means that Venezuela has joined the Ukraine cinematic universe. And we have like a crossover now.
Yeah, that'd be fucking epic. And yeah, I think it goes back to sort of the global communism angle. The presence of this regime in the neighborhood of the United States is just obviously a geopolitical security threat, like plain and simple. And I mean, it's kind of funny. You talk to Venezuelans, and like 90% of the ones abroad will be perfectly happy, myself included, to have even Anthony Blinken install some like idiot puppet regime, because at least it wouldn't be tied into all these people. It's so unbelievably unpopular the government is that at this point people will be perfectly happy to have a CIA coup installed in them. I think you would get an outright majority of Venezuelans in Venezuela supporting that. And that's not to say that it should happen. I think obviously the better solution would be an actual Venezuelan, like legitimate elections, because there is, in spite of their incompetence and splintering, a domestic opposition that's growing even in spite of the massive flight of voters in their ranks to other countries. And I think obviously the better option would be for legitimate elections to be held and a transition of power to be made. And, they fire 18,000 employees, just like Chavez did, and restart the government. I don't know how realistic that's to happen, because I think a lot of the appetite and a lot of the youth and a lot of the vigor has just left the country.
So you think that it's just a decrepit regime that's just going to limp along for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think it's a lot like Cuba.
Right.
Cuba has remained a poor and destitute island for how long? 70 years now?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, well, late 50s, but yeah. Point being, like, and this is ultimately like why I struggle respecting, frankly, a lot of people who talk about civil war and collapse in the United States, because if a regime like Cuba has been around and struggled along since 1959, and they have not been deposed, what makes you think that the United States could collapse like that when it actually has the strongest military in the world and the strongest media propaganda apparatus?
Right.
I see the government in Venezuela, and I'm just reminded of that. It's like, it doesn't actually matter what the will of the people is. It matters who, holds the monopoly in violence. I know, again, that's another cringe libertarian line, but in this case, it's just absolutely true. If you can't enforce your victory, you have no victory. If you can't enforce your vision of the world, then you're just a slave to whoever rules you. And that's the sad reality of living in Venezuela today.
Okay. Well,
and-
I think
yeah.
I think is there I think that covers most of it. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Anything else I wanted to add? No, I mean, I think that covers who Maduro is, who Chavez was, the basic context of Venezuelan democracy, its rise and fall and failure. Was it ever a democracy? Don't know, don't care. At this point, there's a lot of nostalgia, even for like the military dictatorship in the 50s, which tells you just how bad things have gotten. Yeah, ultimately, these people are not your friends. Maduro, no, is not base. He's a moron. He's completely destroyed what should be the wealthiest country per capita in the Western Hemisphere. There's no excuse. And people will say, oh, the demographics or whatever, sure, but there's no excuse for Venezuela to be poor. And
let
the fact that
alone like
continues to be,
it's almost like, well, maybe not quite Haiti levels of garbage, but it's really bad.
it's getting there.
Is it the worst country in South America?
Oh, easily.
Yeah.
That title used to go to places like Bolivia, that were like landlocked peasant countries with like literally nothing but slums. Venezuela used to be a vibrant country, as I mentioned in the beginning. It used to attract immigrants. It used to be, the shining jewel of South America, while the continent was beset by terrorism and military dictatorships and civil wars and communism and fascism and all that stuff. Venezuela was just prosperous, and yes, it had its problems, but it was basically a sort of like middle-income country in a neighborhood of destitute poverty. And now the tables have completely flipped, and it's all because of Chavez, or at least largely because of Chavez and Maduro and the ensuing brain drain that the country has experienced. So, no, not based, not your friends. These people are shipping migrants to your country and are perfectly happy to do it for a quick buck with the Russians.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to do the PowerPoint, for staying on so long. It's very helpful. I learned a lot from this. Hopefully, the chat and kind of the viewers. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. It was kind of funny. I was talking to some friends earlier. It's kind of like, it reminded me of being in school, having to put together a PowerPoint and remembering all the things I've forgotten. It was a lot of fun to put together. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I hope, yeah, as you said, the people learned something.
Okay. God bless, man. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, so that winds it up. I hope people enjoyed that. Not much else to say. I think that was interesting. I guess some people will probably be mad I didn't press him more on certain things, but I was just trying to cover the whole, trying to get through it. And I think we got a pretty good idea from the perspective of as someone who lived in Venezuela. Now, granted, once, as people said, it's an exile. It's somebody who has a bone to pick with the regime, and I'm not going to deny that. But, I mean, he does have an experience living in the country. He does know people who live in the country who operate there, who have to deal with this stuff. So I think that's an interesting and valuable perspective, and I do really appreciate that. So I just have to say, God bless everybody. Have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you all again real soon.